There is a certain kind of quiet in the middle of the night. If you have ever worked late, you know what I mean. For many, driving is just a way to make extra cash. That was the case for an Uber Eats driver. Saturday nights were the busiest because everyone ordered food late. It was a simple routine of picking up food and dropping it off. But one Saturday night at around 1 in the morning, this simple routine turned into a nightmare. He got a request at 1 in the morning to pick up McDonald's for a guy named Kyle. It was a small order, just 2 hamburgers. The customer lived a few minutes away, so the driver grabbed the food and followed the directions. The app eventually led him down a short dead-end street. The house was the last one on this dark road, sitting right next to a line of trees that ran alongside a highway. The house itself was pitch black. Because it was so late, he did not want to ring the bell. He called Kyle, but it went straight to voicemail. Then he got a text telling him to come to the door. He walked up to the front porch, and soon the door opened. A bald man in his 30s stood there. He was drunk, and his breath smelled terrible. Kyle asked the driver to place the food on the kitchen table while he went to the basement to grab a tip. The driver stepped inside the dark kitchen, which smelled absolutely putrid. Since Kyle was taking a long time, the driver began to wander. He stepped into the adjacent living room, which was only lit by a flickering television screen. The smell here was even worse. He noticed that the sliding back glass door was open a crack. Needing fresh air, the driver walked over to the door and stepped out onto the back deck. Suddenly, a motion-sensing light clicked on, revealing 2 large heavy-duty black garbage bags. They were stuffed with 2 long, bulky objects. The plastic was stretched tight, and a swarm of flies was buzzing around them. The smell of death was undeniable. Realizing what was in those bags, the driver panicked. He rushed back inside to the front door. Just as his hand reached the knob, Kyle emerged from the basement holding some bills. He saw the driver and asked where he was going. The driver lied, saying he had to check something in his car. Kyle handed him the cash, but then he looked past him at the back deck where the floodlight was still shining. His smile faded. He asked in a cold, firm voice if the driver had gone out back. The driver said no, but Kyle did not believe him. He lunged forward and grabbed the driver's shoulder. The driver yanked his arm away, ran to his car, and locked the doors. He saw Kyle run back inside and emerge with a massive metal rod, sprinting straight for the car. The driver sped away and immediately called the police. The police arrived in under 2 minutes. They caught Kyle right in the middle of dragging those heavy black bags into the thick bushes of his backyard. It turned out the bags contained 2 actual human bodies. If the driver had stayed in that dark kitchen waiting for his tip for just a minute longer, he might have been his next victim. That case was a terrifying example of how quickly a simple food delivery can turn into a brush with a killer. But sometimes the danger does not come from a direct confrontation. Sometimes it comes in the form of something bizarre and unexplainable. This is exactly what happened to another delivery driver who worked for an Asian eatery. His friend usually worked the counter and took calls, while he did the deliveries, which was exactly the way he liked it. One busy evening, his friend got off the phone and told him he had a delivery ready. He was handed a brown paper bag and set off. The address led him down a small, overgrown dirt driveway off the main road, onto an enclosed property. It was some old, unkempt excuse of a property, and the house itself seemed completely closed off. There was not a single light on anywhere inside, and the grass was incredibly tall. When the driver got out of his car, he could feel the thick grass rubbing against his shins. The entire house looked completely abandoned, and it looked like a place that had been deserted for years. Unsure of what to do, the driver sat in his car and called his friend back at the restaurant. His friend handed the phone to their boss. The boss, who was notoriously stubborn, did not want to lose out on a sale. He yelled at the driver, telling him to stop wasting time, get out of the car, and knock on the door. Realizing he had no choice, the driver sighed, opened his car door, and stepped out. He walked through the tall grass and climbed the 3 wooden steps to the front door. He noticed there was no doorknob on the door. He had to knock loudly on the bare wood. He waited, but there was no response, so he went back to his car. He sat in his driver's seat and pulled out his phone to text his friend, but just as he started typing, he happened to look up at the 2nd story of the house. To his surprise, a light had suddenly turned on in one of the upstairs windows. Someone was definitely inside. He climbed back out of his car and walked back up the wooden steps. He raised his hand and knocked. On his very first knock, the door creaked open a few inches. It had not been latched shut. The driver pushed the door open a little wider and called out. His voice echoed hollowly through the dark, empty hallway. The house was completely quiet. Normally, if you open a door for a delivery, you wait right there. But since the door had opened, the driver assumed the customer wanted him to come inside. He took a hesitant step into the house. The wooden floors creaked loudly under his shoes. He called out again, announcing that he had their food. This time, a muffled voice responded from somewhere upstairs. The voice spoke in Spanish. Saying the words "aquí arriba," the driver knew that "aquí" meant here and "arriba" meant above. He put the two together and realized the person was telling him to come upstairs. In the middle of the hallway, there was a dark staircase. The driver walked over to the bottom step and looked up. At the very top of the stairs, a pale arm reached out from behind the wall ledge. The arm began making a stiff, repetitive beckoning motion. The driver, wanting to get this weird delivery over with, called out that he had the food as he walked up the steps. But as he reached the halfway point, the arm suddenly withdrew. When he reached the top landing, the hallway was almost completely dark. He looked around for the person. That was when he noticed a bedroom door just a few feet away. The room inside was pitch black. But as he stared into the darkness, he saw the pale arm reach out from the doorway once again. It was making that same stiff, unsettling beckoning motion. It was an incredibly creepy sight because the arm was the only thing visible. The rest of the person's body was completely shrouded in the deep shadows of the room, as if they were deliberately hiding. The driver froze. A wave of intense fear washed over him. He realized that something was deeply wrong. He stood his ground in the hallway and spoke in a firm, confident voice. He told the person that he was not going to step inside that dark room. He said they needed to come out with the money, or he was going to leave. For a few seconds, there was absolute silence. Then the arm quickly pulled back into the darkness. A moment later, a heavy, solid object flew out of the bedroom and struck the driver directly in the chest. It fell to the floor with a thud. The driver looked down and realized it was not a toy. It was a real, cold, stiff, severed human arm. The driver screamed, dropped the bag of food, and bolted down the stairs. He ran out of the house, jumped into his car, and sped down the dirt driveway. He did not stop until he reached the neighboring house. He ran to the front door and rang the doorbell. An older woman answered, looking very confused. The driver, hyperventilating and shaking, explained what had just happened. The woman looked at him with sheer horror and said that nobody had lived in that house for over a year. The police were called immediately, but whoever threw that arm had already vanished. But of all the dangers late-night delivery drivers face, the most calculated are the ones involving traps. In the rural areas of New Jersey, the roads can become incredibly isolated. This is the setting for our final story, which happened to a college student taking a gap year. To make money, he worked as a delivery driver at Domino's. On weekends, they closed at 3 in the morning. His boss always threw him on the late shift from 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. There would always be 3 people working that late. On this night, the cook was Jeff, a 28-year-old Italian guy who worked 2 jobs. He was always in a bad mood, so when he told the driver to deliver something, he did it without complaints. Around 2:30 in the morning, just 30 minutes before the store was scheduled to close, they got a late phone call. The driver was told to deliver 2 pizzas to Crocker Drive. He loaded the boxes into his beat-up Honda Civic and took off down the road. It was only a 5-minute drive, but it felt much longer. He lived in the Manchester Township area, which contains nothing but dense trees and empty forests. Once you merged off the main highway onto the smaller back roads, there were absolutely no street lights. The only light that could be seen for miles was the yellow beam of his car's headlights cutting through the dark. Eventually, the GPS instructed him to turn onto a narrow private dirt road. As his car rolled down the dirt path, he suddenly heard a loud, violent bang. This was immediately followed by a flopping sound and a complete loss of steering control. The driver knew instantly that he had a flat tire. He brought the car to a stop and got out to inspect the damage. Sure enough, the front right tire was completely flat. Through his headlights, he could see the house was just a short walk ahead. He decided to deliver the pizzas first, and then ask the customer for help. He walked up to the house. which was completely surrounded by dense trees. The lights inside were on, but the blinds were tightly shut. He rang the doorbell, and a normal-looking young man answered. The driver handed over the pizzas, took the money, and explained the tire situation. The man looked genuinely concerned and offered to help change the tire. They walked back down the driveway together. The man bent down, looked at the tire, and told the driver that he just needed to go inside to grab some tools. The driver started to wonder what he could have hit on a simple dirt driveway. He walked a little further down the road, looking at the ground. The customer noticed and yelled out to him, telling him not to worry about it. But the driver kept walking. A few yards down the road, his eyes caught something in the dirt. He reached down and examined it. It was a small, homemade spike strip. There was absolutely no reason for a spike strip to be lying in the middle of a private driveway, unless it had been placed there deliberately to trap whoever drove down it. A cold wave of fear washed over the driver. He realized the customer had intentionally popped his tire to trap him on the property. He knew he had to play it cool. He stood up, pretended he had not seen anything, and walked back to the car. He told the man that he did not see any debris. The man stared at him with a strange, suspicious look, then turned and went inside to get his tools. The driver waited until the man's back was turned, then jumped into his car, locked the doors, and threw the transmission into reverse. He slammed on the gas, backing out of the driveway as fast as he could while carefully steering around the spike strip. The flat tire wobbled and banged violently against the dirt road. As he reached the main road, he took one last look down the driveway. In the rearview mirror, he saw the young man running out of the house. The man was sprinting at full speed, chasing after the reversing car. The driver did not hesitate. He threw the car into drive and stepped on the gas, forcing the damaged wheel to spin. He had to drive slow enough to not completely destroy his wheel, but fast enough to outrun the man. He kept his speed at around 15 miles per hour. In his rearview mirror, he could see the silhouette of the man running down the dark road after him, but the distance between them slowly grew until the man finally vanished. It was a grueling, tense, 20-minute drive back to the Domino's store. When he finally pulled into the parking lot, the store was just 10 minutes away from closing. He walked inside, carrying the car top sign, and told Jeff and the other female employee what had happened. They were completely shocked. Jeff told him to just leave his car parked there and drive home slowly, since he lived just a few blocks away. The staff closed up the shop and drove off. The driver sat in his car for a few minutes, trying to calm down. Eventually, he started his slow drive home, but as he drove down the quiet, empty streets, he noticed a car behind him. The car was driving with its headlights completely turned off, tailing him closely. He realized the man must have followed him. He pulled over to see if the car would pass. The mysterious car slowly drove past him, but then pulled over on the same side of the street, just a short distance ahead. The driver knew he could not go home and show this person where he lived. He immediately called the police. Within 10 minutes, a police cruiser slowly rolled down the street. The driver honked his horn to get the officer's attention. The cop pulled up alongside him. The driver pointed to the dark car parked just ahead of them, but the moment the driver pointed, the dark car suddenly accelerated, zooming away with its lights still off. The cop immediately turned on his sirens and sped off in pursuit. The driver never found out if the cop caught the man, but he made sure to watch his back every single day after that. 2 months later, he quit his job. Late-night delivery drivers navigate the quietest, most vulnerable hours of the night to bring us food, putting their trust in complete strangers. But as these stories show, the dark streets hold secrets that most of us will never have to face. From deranged murderers trying to hide evidence, to abandoned houses harboring terrifying and grotesque physical threats, to calculated traps set in the dark pine forests, the dangers are incredibly real. These drivers were lucky to survive and tell their stories, but they will never look at a late-night delivery order the same way again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Home is supposed to be the one place where we feel completely safe. It is our sanctuary, but with the rise of smart home technology, we have started to get a peek at what actually happens on our doorsteps when we think nobody is watching. Often, They just capture neighborhood animals. But sometimes they capture something far more sinister, proving that the barrier between our safe indoor world and the terrifying dangers of the outside is incredibly thin. And sometimes, safety is just an illusion. Our first story was shared by a viewer named Trent Leons. Trent and his family had recently moved into his grandparents' house, which was located in a very rural area, deep in the middle of nowhere. Because of how isolated the property was, the family naturally had their guard down. They had several outdoor cats that were very active at night, so they were quite used to hearing occasional rustling outside. But one night, at around 1 o'clock in the morning, everything changed. Most of the family was already fast asleep, but Trent was still awake. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with a notification from their Ring camera. Normally, he would have ignored it, thinking it was just a cat. But this notification was different. It did not just say there was motion. Instead, the screen read that somebody was at the front door. Trent felt a sudden spike of anxiety. At 1 in the morning, in the middle of nowhere, there was no reason for a stranger to be on their porch. He immediately woke up a family member, who grabbed a gun for protection and went to open the front door. Standing on the porch was a man. As soon as the door opened, the stranger instantly raised his hands in the air and began pleading for help. He explained that he was lost and asked if he could use a phone to call someone. The family, still highly suspicious, decided not to let him inside. Instead, they handed him a cell phone through the doorway. The man dialed a number, but nobody answered. Since it was a lost cause, he handed the phone back, thanked them, and began walking away down the dark, unlit road. But the family still felt uneasy. The nearest house was half a mile away, and they did not want this stranger wandering around the area. So 2 family members decided to get into their pickup truck and drive down the road to see where he was going. Sure enough, they found the man walking toward the neighbor's house. They did not want him approaching anyone else's home at this hour, so they pulled up next to him and offered him a ride. They told him he could get in the back, and they would drive him into town. The man agreed. A few minutes later, they arrived in town and dropped him off. The entire time, the man kept his hands up in the air, staring at them as he backed away from the truck. At first, they thought he just needed help, but a week later, they learned something chilling. Neighbors in a nearby subdivision reported that the exact same man had been seen a week prior. He had been going door to door in the middle of the night, in dimly lit areas, asking for help to try and get homeowners to open their doors. It was highly possible he was trying to maliciously gain entry into the homes of sympathetic people. While Trent's family avoided a potential disaster, another homeowner in a quiet suburb was about to capture something truly bizarre. This encounter was shared by a Reddit user named T-Course. It happened late on a cold, rainy night, long after any normal visiting hours had passed. The homeowner was actually away at the time and did not see the notification until the following day. When they finally opened the app to review the footage, they were met with an image that defied explanation. Out of the darkness and the pouring rain, a middle-aged woman carrying an umbrella walked up to the front porch. But it was her face that made the homeowner's blood run cold. Her mouth was stretched wide open, gaping in a silent, unnatural scream. She stood there for about 20 seconds, staring directly ahead with her mouth hanging open. She closed it for just a couple of seconds, proving that her jaw was not locked, before opening it wide again. She pressed the doorbell one more time, waited in silence, and then turned around. She walked back into the rainy night and disappeared. The homeowner had no idea who she was. Some people speculated she might have been suffering from a medical episode, but it still did not explain why she was targeting a stranger's house in the freezing rain. These unexplained encounters are terrifying, but sometimes the threat is right in front of you, moving with terrifying speed. In a quiet suburban town in Illinois, a woman was arriving home after a long day. She walked up to her front door, completely unaware of her surroundings. She had no idea that 2 teenagers were hiding in the shadows of her driveway, watching her every move and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As she unlocked her door and stepped into the warmth of her foyer, the 2 intruders rushed out of the darkness. Before she could close the door behind her, they forced their way inside. The woman screamed in absolute terror as she turned to find 2 strangers standing in her home. The lead intruder, An 18-year-old named Brendan McCrew pointed a weapon at her and told her not to move and not to scream. McCrew demanded her car keys, and knowing her life was on the line, she quickly handed them over. There was another person inside the home at the time, and they were also held at gunpoint. Once the teens had the keys, they ran out to the driveway, jumped into the woman's car, and sped away. Fortunately, neither of the victims was physically injured, and the police were later able to track down and arrest Brendan McCrew. However, his accomplice was never identified and remains at large. In July of 2021, a highly disturbing incident occurred in another suburban neighborhood. A husband was away, leaving his wife home alone. As she worked in the kitchen, she did not notice a tattooed man with a long gray beard walking up her driveway, carrying a plastic bag and talking to himself. He spotted the wife through the window, walked up to the front porch, and began ringing the doorbell. Feeling that something was deeply wrong, she ignored the door, hid in a back room, and called 911, but the man would not leave. He stood there knocking, repeatedly asking if she was sure and saying he had a few questions. Meanwhile, the husband received a notification at work. He pulled up the live feed and used the two-way speaker to ask the man who he was. This only made things worse. The man turned, looked directly into the camera, and began speaking in a chillingly flat voice. He told the husband that he wanted the girl inside to open the door because he was going to rape and kill her. He claimed he had a gun and a knife, and that he would attack her as soon as she let him in. After making these vile threats, he knocked once more and finally walked away, talking to himself in different voices. The police arrested him the next day after another suspicious person report. He was identified as 40-year-old Christopher Sums, a dangerous fugitive from California. Our final story occurred in Bristol, where Kathleen Frazzarelli was winding down late on a Sunday night. Suddenly, she received a notification showing someone at her front door. When she looked at the live feed, she was met with a terrifying sight. Standing on her porch was a figure wearing a mask, with a grotesque, exaggerated smile. Kathleen watched in horror as the masked person tried to turn her door handle. Thankfully, it was locked. The person then knocked and stood there in the darkness for 15 seconds. Before leaving, the masked figure did something chilling. They pulled the sleeve of their sweatshirt over their hand and carefully wiped down the doorknob, erasing any fingerprints they had left behind. Kathleen also noticed a heavy object bulging in the intruder's pocket. A neighbor later reported seeing the masked person carrying a bag as they ran to a waiting car and sped away. The intruder was never identified, but the chilling image of that smiling mask and the cold wiping of the doorknob left Kathleen with a permanent sense of dread, knowing how close she came to a nightmare. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. I worked at a CVS pharmacy open 24 hours a day. I had been there for 3 years and was one of the higher-ups. I agreed to take on the overnight shifts because I believed it would help my chances of getting a promotion and kept my boss happy. Only one employee worked the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, as that was all that was needed. The pharmacy closed early, and the store was dead until business picked up at 9 in the morning when the daytime staff arrived. The 2 evening shift employees before me would leave as soon as my shift started, so I was completely alone in the building for 8 hours. Since there were so few customers, my job duties varied from running the cash register to simply restocking the shelves. We had an electronic beeper at the front entrance that would go off whenever a customer walked through the door. This system was incredibly helpful because it alerted me while I was working in the back aisles, so I would know exactly when to head back to the front register. A few hours into my shift on this particular night, I walked back to the front counter to check my phone, which I had left charging near the register. When I picked it up, I noticed a new voicemail notification from an unknown number. I opened the message and listened to it, but the audio was incredibly strange. It was a highly distorted, muffled voice, and I could not even tell if it belonged to a man or a woman. The sound quality was so bad that I could not understand a single word, and the automated transcription on my phone was completely blank. I figured it was just some random spam call and decided to ignore it. Everyone gets weird calls like that from time to time, so I put my phone back down on the counter and went back to stocking shelves in the middle of the store. But as I was working, my phone started vibrating repeatedly in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a rapid succession of text messages from the same unknown number. The first message said to call back when you can. The second message read, "I know you are at work and I am coming to visit." The third one asked, "What time are you working until?" I had no idea who this could be, and it was starting to make me feel very uneasy. I texted back and immediately asked, "Who the hell is this?" I saw the typing bubble pop up for about 20 seconds, but then it vanished without a reply. I was definitely unnerved, but I had to finish my work, so I pushed the fear aside and kept stalking. Eventually, the front door beeper went off, alerting me that someone had entered. I walked back to the front register and waited, but I did not see anyone walking around the aisles. I stood there for a long time, scanning the empty store, but it was completely quiet. I assumed it was just a glitch or a draft of wind, so I went back to stocking. At around 2 a.m., I brought a new cart of beauty products to the second aisle. As I did, I noticed a woman standing in the corner of the very next aisle, looking down at the bottom shelf. I stepped into her aisle and asked if she needed help finding anything, but she completely ignored me. She did not look up or acknowledge me at all. It felt incredibly awkward, so I decided to leave her alone and walked back to the front register. That was when my phone started vibrating again. The unknown number was spamming me with a series of nonsensical messages. Then, one message arrived that made my heart stop. It simply said, "I am here." I decided I had had enough of this game, so I called the number back. Instantly, I heard a phone ringing from inside the store, right from the beauty aisle. My heart started beating incredibly fast, and my throat went tight. I ended the call, and the ringing in the aisle stopped immediately. I ran back to the safety of the front counter. I did not want to call the police over a prank, so I called my best friend instead. He picked up immediately, and I asked him if he knew any brunette girls who had my number and would pull a sick stunt like this. He guessed a few names, but none of them matched her body shape. My friend told me I was being paranoid, and that I should just go talk to her. I hung up and prepared to walk back over there. But as I looked up, I saw her head slowly peer around the corner of the beauty aisle. She was kneeling on the floor because the shelf was low. The first thing I saw was bright red blood trickling down her cheeks. She was smiling a wide manic smile and making a quiet, choked-up laughing sound. She had deliberately cut her cheeks right next to her lips. I suddenly recognized her face. She was a woman in her late 30s, with severe mental health issues, who had harassed me on Instagram before using fake accounts. As far as I knew, she was supposed to be in a psychiatric hospital because she was considered dangerous. She must have gotten my number from my public social media profile. Seeing her bloody, smiling face made me want to throw up. I yelled at her to get away or I would stab her, which was a total bluff. I ran to the back of the store and hid in a small hallway. I only breathed a sigh of relief when I finally heard the front door chime go off, signaling she had left. I checked the store to make sure she was gone and called the police. They took a report, watched the camera footage, and promised to patrol the area. I blocked her number, and I can only hope her family or doctors found her. I used to work the dairy section of a grocery store, and it was the worst job I ever had. The work was physically exhausting, requiring constant heavy lifting of heavy milk crates, dealing with disgusting expired products, and shivering in the freezing cold. The main dairy cooler was a massive walk-in refrigerator located in the back warehouse area of the store where all the extra stock was kept. Because the cooler was so large and hidden from the main sales floor, I would often go in there just to hide and relax. The supervisors on duty never thought to look for me inside the freezer. I always made sure to bring a thick black hoodie to work, just so I would not freeze while I was avoiding my duties. One night, I was scheduled to work until 10 p.m. The store usually got very quiet after 9, but a strict supervisor named Mr. Senko was on duty, and he was an absolute pain to deal with. He was constantly checking up on the employees, so after stocking the milk cartons one last time, I wheeled my empty cart back to the warehouse area. I wanted to slip into the dairy cooler to hide out for the last hour of my shift. As I walked toward the heavy insulated doors, I glanced through the glass window. For a fraction of a second, I saw a pale human face looking back at me from the dark interior. But as soon as I blinked, the face ducked down and completely vanished from my view. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside. immediately greeted by a blast of freezing air and the roaring sound of the massive refrigeration fans. Stacks of wooden pallets, plastic milk crates, and cardboard boxes were piled high all around the room. I looked around carefully, but I could not see anyone. There were plenty of hiding spots behind the giant columns of inventory, but the space seemed empty. I walked to my usual spot, sat down on an empty crate hidden behind a large stack of boxes, and pulled my hood up to stay warm. Suddenly, the overhead lights in the cooler shut off, plunging the room into near-total darkness. The only light came from the warehouse outside, filtering through the glass window of the doors. My heart jumped into my throat. I immediately assumed that Mr. Senko had figured out I was hiding in there and had shut off the lights to make me come out. I stood up and stepped out from behind the boxes to head for the exit, but as I walked toward the doors, I froze in absolute terror. Standing directly in front of the two cooler doors, blocking my exit, was the silhouette of an incredibly tall person. This could not be Mr. Senko because he was a very short man, and this figure was at least a foot taller than me. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered back on. The figure was completely gone, and the space in front of the doors was empty. I walked over and waved my hand through the air, feeling an icy, overwhelming presence. I bolted through the double doors, slammed them shut, and turned off the light. I checked through the window, but the dark room was empty. I threw my apron on the floor, clocked out early, and ran to my car. I did not care if I got fired, I just needed to get out of there. I do overnight stock shifts for various local Lowe's home improvement stores. My job is highly mobile, and I simply go to whichever specific location needs me for the night. This usually depends on which store is receiving the largest shipment of inventory. My duties include unloading massive delivery trucks, operating heavy forklifts through the warehouse and sales floor, and stocking the shelves before the stores open to the public. On one quiet night, the only other person in the entire store with me was a truck driver named Paul. Once we finished successfully unloading his truck, he helped me sort the heavy packages in the back receiving room. After that, he said goodbye and drove off to make another pickup, leaving me completely alone in the massive, quiet building. I went about my normal routine, scanning new shipments with my handheld inventory gun, and driving the forklift to transport the items out to the main retail floor to stock the empty shelves. I was scanning items in the back when a loud crash made me jump. A large box had fallen from a high stack of pallets. The box was still sealed, so nothing spilled, but as I got closer, I noticed a very strange foul odor in the air. I dismissed it, got the forklift to put the box back, and continued my work. Later, I turned into the paint aisle and saw someone dressed in dark clothing walking at the other end. No one else was supposed to be in the store, and they had no uniform. I yelled at them, and they immediately sprinted down a side aisle. I chased after them, but they disappeared. I returned to the warehouse, and another loud crash came from the exact same pile of pallets. I grabbed a tall ladder and climbed up to inspect the stack. At the top of the boxes, I discovered a hidden space enclosed by a wall of packages. Crouching inside this cardboard nest was a disheveled man dressed in all black. He was the source of the foul smell. He stared at me and then stood up, lunging in my direction. I quickly scrambled down the ladder, jumped to the floor, and ran to call the police. The police arrived 15 minutes later, but the man had fled. When management checked the security cameras, they discovered he had been living in that secret box fortress for an entire week. He only came down at night to steal food and water, remaining completely unnoticed right above the staff. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was late October when Tyler and his girlfriend Stacy decided they needed a weekend getaway to escape their stressful daily routines. They wanted to see the autumn foliage in Vermont, so they booked a cozy hilltop cabin in Stowe through Glamping Hub. They had been working extra hours, and this trip was meant to help them unwind. They had the rental from Thursday night until Sunday, looking forward to a quiet weekend. When they arrived late on Thursday evening, the surrounding woods were pitch black. The cabin had a keyless entry system. The owner had sent Tyler the code beforehand, and it worked perfectly. Stepping inside, they found the place warm and inviting. Everything was made of wood, giving it an old-fashioned country feel and a distinct wood smell. It had a bathroom, a small kitchen, 3 bedrooms, and a living room. There were 2 televisions, but they noticed that one of the bedroom doors was locked. The listing had mentioned 3 bedrooms, so they were not sure why this one was sealed off. However, they assumed the owner had some personal belongings stored in there. To keep the master bedroom neat, they placed most of their luggage in the 2nd bedroom. Since they arrived late, they went straight out to dinner in town, walked around the village for a bit, and then returned to watch a movie before calling it a night. The next day was cloudy and chilly. They went out to hike along some dirt trails in the woods near the cabin. Upon returning, Tyler took a hot shower and changed. When he got out, Stacy told him she had heard a strange noise in the bedroom with the locked door, like a radio or a low voice recording. Tyler went up to the door and pressed his ear against it, but it was silent. He knocked on the door to tease Stacy, which made her nervous. She told him to stop because the idea of someone being in there freaked her out. While Stacy was taking her shower, Tyler sat in the living room. That was when he heard a very slight sound coming from inside the locked room. He muted the television and pressed his ear against the door. He definitely heard a faint speaking noise, like a radio playing at a low volume. He messaged and then called the host to report the issue. The host was confused and said he was not sure why the door would be locked, but his wife might have left some of her things in there. Tyler and Stacy went out for lunch at Harrison's on Main Street. He did not tell her about the noise he heard because he did not want to ruin her day. While they were relaxing at a park later, the host called back. He said his wife confirmed she did not lock the door and had no idea what they could be hearing. He offered to come by and unlock it to check. Tyler agreed, and they headed back to the cabin. When they returned, Stacy collapsed on the couch, exhausted. Tyler went to the locked door and heard the same radio sounds again. Suddenly, he had an idea. He walked outside and went over to the window of the locked bedroom. There were no curtains blocking the view. Standing on his tiptoes, Tyler looked inside and was horrified. He saw a tall, extremely thin young man in a dark hood dancing slowly in the center of the room. He was holding a small radio in his hand. The stranger noticed Tyler at the window, stopped dancing, and stared back with a wide, terrifying smile. Tyler began screaming for Stacy to get out of the house. He grabbed their bags, threw them in the car, and drove off in a panic. He called the host and told him to contact the police. An hour later, the host called back to say the police had searched the cabin. The strange man was gone, but they found multiple empty bags of potato chips under the bed. The intruder had been living in that locked room the entire time Tyler and Stacy were there, listening to them sleep. They spent the rest of the trip at a nearby motel, but Tyler could not forget that smiling, dancing figure. Our next story takes us to a dark, rainy Friday night in the middle of October. A young man named Jake was driving home late after attending a Halloween housewarming party. Jake worked long, erratic hours as a nurse at a hospital, so his sleep schedule was always ruined. By the time he arrived at the party, he was already exhausted from a grueling 12-hour shift. To keep himself awake, he had taken an Adderall before leaving his apartment and had stopped at a gas station to buy drinks. There were about 30 people packed into the small house, and Jake spent most of the night trying to make polite conversation. But as the hours wore on, the deep exhaustion made him desperately want to go home to bed. Eventually, Jake decided to do an Irish goodbye, quietly slipping out through the back door to avoid saying goodbye to everyone. He ran through the heavy rain, climbed into his Subaru, and started the engine. He did not turn on any music, preferring the quiet peace of the rain hitting the windshield as he drove down the slick roads. As he was driving down a quiet residential street, his headlights caught the figure of a young girl walking alone in the pouring rain. She had an umbrella, no raincoat, and was completely drenched. As Jake drew closer, the girl stopped walking and turned to look directly at his car. Jake debated whether to pull over. Ultimately, his compassionate side won. He pulled his Subaru over to the curb, rolled down his window, and asked if she needed a ride. Without saying a single word, the girl opened the door and climbed into the back seat. A sudden draft of cold air filled the car as she shut the door. Jake looked at her through his rearview mirror and asked where she was heading. She spoke in a quiet voice, telling him that she just needed to go to the end of this road. Jake nodded, put the car in drive, and continued down the street. As he stopped at a second stop sign, Jake tried to make light conversation. He asked her why she was out walking in such a terrible storm without a jacket. She replied that she was just in a hurry to get back and did not want to wait around for an expensive cab. Jake made a quick joke about how overpriced rideshares had become these days. He introduced himself as Jake. The girl quietly replied that her name was Ali, and she thanked him for picking her up. After that, no more words were exchanged. The car fell silent except for the sound of the windshield wipers. Jake looked up at the rearview mirror once more and noticed that Ali was staring straight ahead, her eyes looking completely distant. He continued driving down the street until he noticed a dead-end sign. He brought the car to a stop near the sign and asked Ali if her destination was past the dead end. He did not get an answer. Jake looked up at his rearview mirror, expecting to see her sitting in the back seat, but the reflection showed nothing but empty space. His heart stopped. He slammed his foot on the brake, threw the car into park, and turned his head completely around. The back seat was completely empty. Panicking, Jake pulled the car over and turned on the interior light. He jumped out into the pouring rain, opened the rear door, and searched the entire back row. There was absolutely nobody there. He looked up and down the empty road, but there was not a single soul in sight. He had never heard the car door open or close, which was impossible because his Subaru doors made a very loud click when opened. Then, Jake touched the fabric of the seat where Ali had been sitting. The seat should have been soaked, but there was not a single drop of water on the fabric. Jake stood there in the pouring rain, his mind racing. He looked to the right of his parked car, just beyond a low metal fence, and saw the dark iron gates of an old, quiet cemetery. The girl's words echoed in his mind. She had asked to go to the end of this road, and the end of this road was the cemetery. Terrified, Jake scrambled back into his car, locked the doors, turned the heater on, and sped away as fast as his car would go. He spent the rest of the night shivering in his bed, unable to forget the girl who had vanished. Our final story takes place in Oak Hill, Ohio, during a chilly weekend in mid-October. A group of close friends named Joe, Carl, Cody, and the narrator had a long-standing tradition of visiting haunted attractions every Halloween. That year, they decided to check out a highly rated haunted corn maze. The drive to Oak Hill was quiet, with the dark highway stretched out before them and the cold autumn wind blowing dry leaves across the road. When they finally pulled into the dirt parking lot, they could see the bright floodlights from a distance, surrounded by cars. The air smelled of roasted nuts, mixed with the sound of laughter and distant screams echoing from deep within the cornfield. While waiting in line, they overheard some kids saying how the maze had to shut down the previous year because an actor had actually hurt a customer. The rumor was that an actor in a costume had pushed a visitor, causing them to close for the night. This news added to their nerves, making them feel like the actors here might go above and beyond typical jump scares. Once inside, the maze felt like a normal attraction. Tall corn stalks towered over them, and actors occasionally jumped out to startle them. Speakers blasted spooky sound effects, and Halloween decorations were scattered everywhere. Eventually, they came to a split in the path, with a sign pointing left for safety and right for danger. They decided to split up, with Cody and the narrator taking the left safety path. They expected this path to actually be the scarier one, designed to trick visitors. As they walked, the tall cornstalks blocked out almost all of the ambient light, casting long shadows across the narrow path. The ground was cold and muddy, making their footsteps sound heavy and wet as they moved deeper into the dark, rustling crops. They turned a dark corner and saw an actor standing completely still. The person wore an all-black outfit with a blank white pullover mask that had only 2 eye holes and no mouth or nose. The figure held a pumpkin and slowly walked toward them, gesturing for them to take it. As they drew closer, they noticed the white mask was slightly dirty, with crude stitching around the eye holes. The eyes staring out from behind the fabric looked completely cold and unblinking, making the encounter even more uncomfortable. He spoke in a deep, raspy, disguised voice, whispering for them to take it. They laughed and tried to walk past, but the masked figure stepped into their path, blocking them. He began to follow them closely, repeating the same words over and over. He kept insisting that they take the pumpkin. The joke was starting to feel old, but the man continued to stalk them down the path for over a minute, his tone becoming increasingly aggressive. Finally, the man stopped. glared through his hollow eye holes, and growled that if they did not take it, he would kill them. The narrator did not take the threat seriously in a public attraction, but he wanted the encounter to end, so he took the heavy pumpkin from the man's hands. The pumpkin felt surprisingly heavy and cold in his hands, and a faint, sweet smell of rotting fruit seemed to drift from the top, which was damp to the touch. The masked figure immediately stopped moving, allowing them to walk away. A few minutes later, they reunited with Joe and Carl at the exit path. The friends laughed when they saw the narrator carrying a real pumpkin. As they walked toward the exit, another actor dressed in a zombie costume broke character and approached them. He pointed at the pumpkin and told them visitors were not allowed to take props. The narrator explained that the actor in the white mask had given it to him. The zombie actor looked confused and asked where they had met this person. When the narrator pointed back to the left path, the actor quickly walked away to investigate. When they reached the bright lights of the main exit, the narrator noticed the top of the pumpkin was sliced open. Curious, he grabbed the stem and lifted the lid, expecting a silly prop or candy inside. But what he saw made his stomach turn. Lying at the bottom of the pumpkin was a pile of small, fleshy objects. When the narrator reached in and picked one up, his heart stopped. It was a real severed human finger. There were about 9 other human fingers resting at the bottom. Drawn in black marker on the orange skin of the pumpkin was a pair of eyes and the words, "Always watching," with a smiley face. The group screamed in terror and ran to a young girl working the ticket booth. She called her supervisor, and within minutes, the police arrived and shut the entire corn maze down. Several police cruisers rolled into the parking lot, with their blue lights flashing, casting shadows across the dark fields. The officers spoke in serious tones as they stretched yellow crime scene tape across the main entrance. The police questioned the boys and took the pumpkin for forensic testing. They searched the massive cornfield with dogs, but because the attraction was in a remote area, the mysterious man in the blank mask was never found. To this day, they do not know who the man in the mask was, or whose fingers they had been carrying through that dark maze. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Many people find comfort in a good thunderstorm. The sound of the rain hitting the roof, the distant rumble of thunder, and the cool breeze can be incredibly relaxing. For a father and his 6-year-old son living in Florida, storms were always something to look forward to. Ever since the father was a child, he loved watching the sky light up, and he passed that same love down to his little boy. Whenever a storm rolled in, they had a special tradition. They would head out to their backyard gazebo to sit together, watch the clouds roll in, and listen to the rain. On a hot, stormy August night, a massive storm system began to sweep across their Florida neighborhood. As they sat in the living room, the first massive strike of lightning cracked across the sky, shaking the windows. The little boy jumped up immediately, his face lighting up with excitement. He looked at his dad and said, "Let us go sit outside." The father smiled, stood up, and followed his son out the back door. They ran through the pouring rain, getting pretty wet on the way before making it safely under the cover of their gazebo. The father had a nice setup under his backyard gazebo, which had a mini bar, a few comfortable wicker sofas, a television, and a mini fire pit. As they usually did, he turned on the fire pit and the TV, and they laid back to relax, listening to the sound of the pouring rain and the constant thunder. The thunder got louder as they sat out there, and the time between the flashes of lightning and cracks of thunder was getting shorter. The bulk of the storm was getting closer, and the lightning was getting so bright that it lit up the entire yard whenever it flashed. The backyard was very large, with dense woods covering 2 edges of it. After a particularly massive flash of lightning, the little boy suddenly pointed out toward the yard. The father asked what he saw, and the boy replied that someone was standing in the backyard. The father stood up and walked to the very edge of the gazebo, peering into the dark. He could not see anything at first, so he waited for another flash of lightning. The next few flashes were too small, but when the next earth-rumbling flash struck, he saw exactly what his son meant. There was indeed someone standing out in his backyard, right by the edge of the woods. The father told his son to go rush inside the house and turn on the backyard floodlights. The boy ran inside without question, and the father stood in place, keeping his eyes on the spot. 10 seconds later, the lights turned on, but the person was no longer there. The father went inside the house, locked all the doors, and kept the outside lights on. He turned on the front yard lights too. He did not want to panic his wife, so when she asked if they should call the police, he lied and told her the person had left. He claimed it was a woman, thinking it sounded less scary. They tried to distract themselves by watching a movie, and eventually, the mother tucked the boy into bed. But later, the father was startled to find his son standing at his bedroom door, terrified, saying there was someone at his bedroom window. The father pulled his son away from the doorway, looking at the window and waiting for the lightning. When it struck, no one was there, but he believed his son. He told his wife and child to stay inside while he went out to look. Even though his wife did not want him to, he grabbed a heavy wooden baseball bat from the closet and stormed out into the heavy rain. After turning all the lights back on, he searched the front of the house, then the side, and then the back. He looked under the patio tables, inside the gazebo, and under the deck. When he thought the backyard was clear, the last site to check was the right side of the house. As he began to walk toward that side, he instantly saw a person wearing a dark hood, peering around the corner of the house. He could only see half of their face and head, as the rest of their body was hidden behind the wall. It looked like a man. The father screamed, raised his bat, and charged toward the corner. The person immediately disappeared behind the corner. When the father rounded the corner, they were gone. He went back inside and told his family that he had chased the man away, though his wife was terrified to hear it was a man. He closed all the blinds in the house, and they were not bothered again that night. The boy was so scared that he slept in his parents' bed, and the father stayed awake, wondering who was lurking in the dark. In another town close by, a teenager was about to experience a very similar nightmare. The city where he lived almost never got any rainfall, so when they did, it was a very exciting event. Kids would run outside to play, farmers would celebrate, and everyone would enjoy the rare scenery. On this night, a big thunderstorm was rolling in. The teenager was playing a video game online with his friends when the storm hit. He knew it was coming, because everybody's microphones picked up the same massive sound of thunder at the same time. It was so loud he thought it was a gunshot or a firework. Then he saw the lightning outside his window and hopped over to his bed to watch the storm form. But what he saw across the street was unsettling. There was a tall man standing there, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He was just standing still in the rain. The teenager could not tell if the man was looking at him, because his face was obscured. Eventually, the man started walking down the street, which brought some relief, though the teenager still felt paranoid. About 15 minutes later, the storm had fully started. He told his friends he was leaving to go watch the storm from his porch. He walked out and stood under the porch, watching the rain and lightning. But when he looked down the street to his left, the man was there again, standing at the corner of the street. The teenager tried to ignore him, and after 5 minutes, he went back inside. As he opened the door, he looked back and saw that the man was gone. Inside the house, his younger siblings were playing and dancing. The teenager went back to his room, but instead of playing the game, he sat there feeling uneasy. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with 2 texts from an unknown number. The first text read, "Have you forgotten?" And the second read, "I know you did not." His first thought was the man he had seen outside, but he wondered how a stranger could have his number. He assumed his friends were pulling a prank on him, so he asked them in their group chat. They all swore they had nothing to do with it. Later that night at 12:19, there was a loud knock at the front door. It was way too late for visitors. He peered through the blinds, but the rain was coming down so hard it looked like a blanket of mist, blocking his view. Suddenly, a massive clap of thunder shook the house, causing him to bump his head against the glass. He saw a figure running off the porch, and he knew it was the same man from earlier. He wanted to call the police, but he had no proof. He decided to try and sleep, but about 3 hours later, a loud bang on his window woke him. He peeked through the blinds and saw the man with his hands pressed against the glass, staring in. The scariest part was his mouth, which was stretched into a giant maniacal smile that did not look human. The man stood there for a moment, then walked away. The next morning, the teenager found a note taped to his window that read, Have you forgotten? The third encounter happened to a young woman who was working late during a violent thunderstorm. It was about midnight when she finally left her job to drive home. She drove a small 2005 Ford Fusion, which was not built for handling severe weather and flooded roads. She took her usual route home, but the rain was so bad that even with her windshield wipers on the highest setting, she could barely see. She was going 40 miles per hour in a 55-mile-per-hour zone because the road was so hazardous. There were no other cars on the road. Suddenly, through the heavy sheets of water on her windshield, she saw someone dressed in white running across the road from one side of the woods to the other. She saw them almost too late and had to slam on her brakes and swerve. She lost control of the car, slid onto the grass, and crashed head-on into a large tree. The airbag deployed instantly, leaving her in complete shock. Her car was totaled, and she was stranded on a quiet, dark highway with no buildings nearby. She tried calling her brother and sister, but neither of them answered because they were asleep. With no other options, she called her father, who woke up and promised to drive out to help her immediately. He told her to lock her doors and stay inside the car. About 10 minutes passed, and she texted her father to see if he was close. He replied that he was. Her hazard lights were flashing, cutting through the dark rain. Suddenly, she felt an intense urge to look to her right. She turned and screamed at the top of her lungs, feeling her heart drop out of her body. There was a soaking wet man dressed in white looking into her car. His eyes were squinted, and his mouth was hung wide open in a bizarre O shape. He put his wet hands on the glass and began rubbing the window. She yelled at him to go away, but he grabbed the handle and tried to open the locked door. When it would not open, he began violently pounding his fists against the glass, keeping his mouth in that creepy O shape. Terrified, she called her father back, crying that a man was trying to break into her car. Her father screamed through the phone, telling her to keep the doors locked and promising he was almost there. He stayed on the line as the man outside began hitting the window with his elbow, trying to shatter it. Fortunately, the glass held. Suddenly, she saw headlights pull up behind her car. It was her father. The man outside turned toward the newly arrived car, and as her father stepped out, he charged at the creep. The man in white tried to run toward the woods, but her father tackled him to the ground and violently beat him. He held him down in the pouring rain while the young woman called the police. Not long after, multiple police cruisers and a tow truck arrived, and the man was arrested. The police identified him as Marcus Green. Once Marcus Green was in custody, detectives began a thorough investigation to understand the full scope of his activities. When they searched his vehicle, they found a gray hoodie that matched the one worn by the man who had terrorized the teenager. But the most disturbing evidence was discovered when they searched his apartment. Detectives found a collection of wet clothes, including the white outfit from the highway crash, as well as several burner phones. They also recovered a handwritten notebook filled with detailed maps, logs, and photographs. As they went through the pages, they realized that Marcus Green had been systematically stalking multiple families in the region. He had hand-drawn maps of the Florida family's property, including the layout of their backyard gazebo and notes on the daily routines of the parents and their 6-year-old son. Next to the maps, he had written down descriptions of the son's bedroom window and detailed logs of when the family usually watched movies. The notebook also contained the address of the teenager who had received the creepy text messages. Police discovered that Marcus Green had stolen pieces of mail from the teenager's mailbox, using the information to look up the family's records online, and purchase the boy's personal phone number. The digital forensics on his burner phones confirmed that he had sent the messages saying, "Have you forgotten, and I know you did not." The investigation reconstructed Marcus Green's exact method of operation, revealing a highly calculated and disturbing pattern. He was a predator who had a dark obsession with severe weather. He monitored local weather forecasts and waited for the most intense thunderstorms to plan his stalking sessions. He realized that the heavy rain, wind, and thunder provided the perfect cover, drowning out the sound of his footsteps and allowing him to approach homes and windows completely undetected. He took a sick pleasure in the shock value of his actions, knowing that the sudden flashes of lightning would briefly reveal his presence to his victims, creating a terrifying jump scare effect. For the young woman in the Ford Fusion, His actions had been a deliberate trap. He had waited in the woods along that dark, isolated highway, knowing the storm would force drivers to slow down, and had intentionally run across the road to cause her to crash. His plan was to wait until she was trapped and helpless before forcing his way into her car. Armed with this mountain of evidence, the prosecution built an airtight case against him. During the trial, the teenage victim, the young woman, and her father all gave emotional testimonies. The jury was shown the notebook, the maps, and the digital logs. After a brief deliberation, Marcus Green was convicted of stalking, attempted burglary, and reckless endangerment, and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term with no possibility of parole. Even though Marcus Green was locked away behind bars, the emotional scars left on his victims were deep and lasting. The 6-year-old boy was left with a severe fear of the dark and the rain, unable to sleep in his own room during storms. His parents eventually sold their Florida home and moved to another state, hoping a fresh start would help him heal. The teenager could no longer enjoy playing video games without feeling a constant wave of paranoia, and his family also decided to relocate to a larger city for a sense of security. The young woman who had crashed her Ford Fusion struggled with severe driving anxiety, eventually selling her car and avoiding driving at night or during heavy rain altogether. The families were left with unanswered questions about why they had been chosen, but they found comfort in knowing that they had survived and that the predator was finally off the streets. Their experiences served as a haunting reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not creatures of legend, but real people waiting outside our windows in the dark. They are out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the perfect storm to strike, and we must always be vigilant. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When I was growing up, the attic in our family home always scared me much more than the basement did. I know that for most people, the basement is the ultimate source of childhood nightmares. It is dark, damp, and usually buried underground. But for me, there was just something about our attic that really got to me. If I had to guess why, I would say it was because our attic was slightly unconventional compared to what you are probably picturing right now. For starters, it was surprisingly spacious. Most attics are typically cramped, dusty, and congested, which makes perfect sense for storage. But our attic was built in such a way that you did not ever have to crouch when you were up there. You could walk around completely upright without any issue. Now you might think that having all that extra space would imply we used it more often, the same way anyone would take advantage of excess room in their house. But that was not the case at all. I am not really sure why, but my parents treated it like a glorified storage room. That was its sole purpose. Thinking about it now, they honestly avoided going up there as much as possible. The other thing about our attic was that it had so many odd nooks and crannies built into it. What I mean by that is the entire space was broken up by heavy wooden support beams and small, sudden changes in the elevation of the floor. It was almost like walking through a makeshift maze. These beams were of completely uneven thickness, and there was absolutely no pattern to where they appeared. The result of this strange architecture was that you could not stand in any one place up there and have a clear line of sight from one end of the attic to the other. There was always something blocking your view, and the uneven flooring was a total nightmare. The floor was not completely boarded over, leaving exposed ceiling joists and thick layers of pink fiberglass insulation in between. You could genuinely injure yourself up there if you were not paying close attention to where you stepped. My dad used to joke that one day one of us would slip on one of those joists, fall straight through the insulation, and puncture a giant hole in the living room ceiling below. So you can easily imagine why an attic like that would be deeply unsettling to a little kid. The maze-like quality of the space was what freaked me out the most. I really did not like the feeling of not being able to see the attic in its entirety. Every single time I had to go up there, I felt this overwhelming sensation that someone or something was hiding just out of sight, right behind one of those thick wooden beams. But anyway, what I am about to tell you happened so long ago that I do not have a ton of other clear memories from that specific period in my life. For whatever reason, however, this particular memory is so incredibly vivid that it feels like a sharp thorn protruding into what was otherwise a fantastic and peaceful childhood. It happened during the middle of the school week, which I remember clearly because I had classes that day. I am not entirely sure how old I was at the time, but I was in middle school, probably around 12 or 13. I woke up one ordinary morning and immediately noticed that my feet were incredibly dirty. The bottoms of my feet were completely gray and grimy, and there was this fine layer of dark grit stuck between my toes that I could not easily explain. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring down at my feet, trying to figure out what on earth had happened. I had not gone outside the night before. I had not done anything unusual or messy. I had just gone to bed at my normal time, fallen asleep in my clean room, and somehow woken up with absolutely filthy feet. Being a typical kid, I did not give the situation too much thought beyond that initial confusion. I just hopped into the bathroom, washed my feet off in the bathtub, and went about my normal school day. But things only started to escalate from there. A few days later, I came home from school and found a strange cardboard box sitting in my bedroom that absolutely did not belong there. It was a small, dusty box filled to the brim with old, faded family photographs. It was the exact kind of box that my parents kept stored away deep in the attic. I had absolutely no memory of going upstairs to get it, let alone bringing it down to my room. When I asked my mom about it, she just naturally assumed that I had been rummaging through the attic for some reason and had forgotten to put it back. I tried to tell her that I had not done any such thing, but she did not seem very concerned. She just picked up the box, took it back upstairs to the attic, and that was that. Then it happened again. Just a few days after the photo box incident, I woke up another morning and found an old heavy brass lamp sitting directly on my desk. It was this incredibly ugly, outdated brass thing that I only vaguely recognized from seeing it stored away in the attic years prior. This time I was absolutely positive that I had not brought that lamp down myself. I would have definitely remembered carrying a heavy, awkward metal lamp through the dark hallway of my house in the middle of the night. But there it was, sitting on my desk as if it had been there all along. That was the moment when all the pieces of the puzzle started clicking into place. The dirty feet, the dusty box of photographs, and now the heavy brass lamp on my desk. I was not just sleepwalking around my room, I was sleepwalking all the way up to the attic. The realization did not scare me right away, but it made me feel incredibly strange. The mere idea that I was unconsciously navigating that dangerous maze of wooden beams and uneven flooring in the absolute pitch black, completely unaware of what I was doing, was deeply unsettling. I decided to tell my parents about it, and they reacted exactly how you would expect typical parents to react. They told me that sleepwalking was completely normal for kids my age, that lots of children did it, and that I would probably just grow out of it in a few months. I would not exactly say they were dismissive, but they certainly were not overly concerned either. To them, it was just a phase, but to me it felt like something much more ominous. After that conversation, I started completely dreading bedtime. I would lie awake in bed for hours after I was supposed to be asleep, fighting the urge to close my eyes because I was absolutely terrified of what my body might do once I lost consciousness. Of course, I could not fight off sleep forever. Every single morning, the very first thing I would do upon waking up was frantically check the bottoms of my feet to see if they were dirty. If they were clean, I knew it had been a good night. But if they were gray and covered in grit, I knew it had been a bad night. Fortunately, they were usually clean, but those few times when they were dirty really started to get to me. There was no denying the fact that I was definitely going up to the attic on a regular basis, and the absolute worst part about the whole thing was that I had no memory of it whatsoever. For all I knew, I was spending more time wandering around up in that dark attic than I was sleeping in my own bed. The fear I felt during that period of my life was a slow, creeping dread that never truly went away. It was awful, but absolutely nothing compared to what happened next. I woke up one night, only to quickly realize it was not morning at all. It was still pitch black outside. It took my brain a few seconds to process what was happening, but I realized I was not lying down in my warm bed. In fact, I was not even lying down at all. I was standing completely upright. That was the very first thing my senses registered. I was standing straight up in complete impenetrable darkness, and I had absolutely no idea where I was. For a few terrifying seconds, my brain could not even begin to process my surroundings. But then, the sudden recognition hit me like a physical blow. I was standing in the middle of the attic. The wave of pure terror that washed over me was so intense that I almost could not draw a single breath into my lungs. I was in the attic, in the dead of night, surrounded by pitch-black darkness. I could not see a single thing. I could not see the support beams. I could not see the storage boxes. I could not see the exit hatch. Nothing. It was just absolute, heavy blackness. To make matters even worse, because of the maze-like layout of the room, I had absolutely no idea where in the attic I was actually standing. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity, far too scared to take even a single step. It felt like sleep paralysis, but multiplied by 100. I knew the general layout of the attic, but only vaguely from the few times I had been up there during the day. I also knew that there were dangerous obstacles and exposed joists everywhere. The idea of trying to find my way back to the exit hatch in complete darkness was almost unthinkable, but I knew I could not just stand there frozen forever. So, I slowly and painfully started to move. I was so incredibly scared that I actually started to cry, but I forced myself to weep silently. The tears were just flooding down my face, and I felt this intense, primal instinct that if I made too much noise, something terrible was going to get me. It was easily the most terrified I have ever been in my entire life. As I crept forward, I could not shake this horrible, distinct feeling that I was not actually alone up there. I do not know what was giving me that thought, but I could feel another presence in the room with me, somewhere further back in the darkness. And right as that thought crossed my mind, I actually heard something. There was a soft, distinct thud from somewhere in the darkness behind me. It honestly sounded exactly like a footstep, or like someone slowly shifting their weight on the old wooden floorboards. I kept moving as fast as I safely could, but then I heard the exact same sound twice more. Both times, the sound seemed to be coming from a slightly different spot in the room, as if whatever was making the noise was slowly following me through the maze of beams. At that point, I was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was another person up there in the dark. I do not know how long it actually took me to stumble across the exit hatch, but my hand finally brushed against the wooden frame, and I found it. I practically threw myself down the ladder, ran straight to my parents' bedroom, and woke them up. I was full-on sobbing at that point, completely unable to hold my terror in any longer. I hysterically told them exactly what had happened, how I had woken up standing in the dark, and how I had to feel my way back to the hatch. I also told them about the distinct footsteps I had heard, and I insisted that there was someone else hiding up in our attic. I fully expected my dad to spring out of bed, grab his baseball bat, and rush up there to investigate. But he did not. In fact, neither of them took me seriously at all. My mom just wrapped her arms around me, hugged me tight, and told me that everything was going to be okay. She explained that sleepwalking can cause incredibly realistic and vivid nightmares, and that waking up in the middle of it must have just confused my senses. My dad offered to put a physical lock on the outside of the attic hatch if it would make me feel safer, and I immediately said yes. But I knew what I had heard. I kept insisting that they had to at least check the attic, and my dad finally sighed and agreed just to calm me down. As I stood there watching my dad slowly climb up the ladder into the dark attic, there was a part of my young mind that genuinely believed he was not going to make it back down. But not even 2 minutes later, he was already climbing back down the wooden ladder. He looked at me, told me there was absolutely nothing up there, and told me to go back to sleep. So, that is what I did. But lying awake in my bed for the rest of that night was easily the worst experience of my life. Strangely enough, after that terrifying night, the sleepwalking stopped completely. I am still not sure what I would have done if it had continued. And speaking of that night, I have never been able to fully accept the logical sleepwalking explanation my parents gave me. I know that sleepwalking is a real, scientifically documented thing that happens to people, and there is nothing supernatural about it. But there is a part of my mind that just cannot let it go. The way I always ended up in the exact same place, the attic, and never anywhere else in the house. The way I was apparently capable of flawlessly navigating a complex maze of uneven joists and dangerous obstacles in complete darkness without ever hurting myself. And most of all, the footsteps I heard while I was standing there in the dark. I still believe to this day that there was something up there with me. I really do. What it actually was, I have no idea. I am obviously a lot older now, and I have brought up these concerns to my parents several times over the years, but they always give me the exact same dismissive answers. It almost feels as if they themselves do not want to think about what might have actually been up there, which also does not make much sense to me. I doubt I will ever get the real answers I am looking for. Now, this next event happened when I was about 14 or 15 years old. My family lived in this very old historical house that had been passed down through our family for generations. My dad had grown up in that exact house, and his parents had lived there before him. I do not live there anymore, but I still find myself thinking about what happened there from time to time. Like most old family homes, this house had a large attic. It was basically a giant graveyard for stuff that nobody in the family wanted to deal with. It was packed with old broken furniture, boxes of God knows what, and massive containers of Christmas decorations. That last item was the only reason anyone ever set foot up there. We went up once a year right before the holidays to get the decorations, and then once more after the holidays to put everything back. This story happened around Christmas time, but the holiday itself has basically nothing to do with what actually occurred. That particular Christmas, my dad decided that I was finally old enough to go up and grab the heavy decoration boxes myself. He gave me the whole rundown before I went up. He explained which boxes to look for, mentioned that the Christmas lights were in a separate plastic container near the back wall, and I just nodded along as if I were paying close attention. But I was not really. I was a teenager, and my mind was focused on something else entirely. Once we finished talking, he sent me up to the attic. I climbed the squeaky wooden ladder and pulled down the little metal chain to turn on the single dusty light bulb hanging from the ceiling. I remember standing there, looking around at the cluttered space, and realizing that I genuinely could not remember the last time I had actually been up there. But then, I realized I had a major problem. I had absolutely no idea what my dad had just told me to grab. I could not remember a single one of his instructions, and there was absolutely no way I was going back downstairs to ask him to repeat himself. My dad had a very strict policy about that. He would get legitimately angry if you made him say the same thing twice. So, rather than face his temper, I just started opening random cardboard boxes that looked like they might contain holiday decorations. I moved things around for probably 20 minutes, and in the process, I ended up making a complete and total mess of the entire attic. I did eventually find the correct Christmas boxes, which spared me the immense anxiety of having to go back downstairs empty-handed. But the attic itself was completely disorganized at that point. I made about 4 or 5 trips up and down the ladder, hauling the heavy boxes to the living room. Once I was finally finished, I decided to go back up for one last look, just to make sure I had not missed anything important. I knew I was eventually going to have to clean up the mess I made, which I was not looking forward to at all. As I was looking around the chaotic attic, bracing myself for all the heavy lifting I was going to have to do to put things back in order, I noticed something that looked completely out of place. In one of the far back corners of the room, tucked away behind a stack of old furniture that I had just moved, there was a box I had never seen before. It was solid black, and it did not look like a flimsy cardboard box. It was made of a much sturdier, heavy-duty material, almost like an old document box or one of those fireproof security safes. Despite its sturdy construction, it somehow looked significantly older than everything else stored in the attic. Being a naturally curious teenager, I obviously went over and opened it. Inside the box were papers, dozens and dozens of them. It was an alarming amount of written material. There were old notebooks, loose sheets of yellowed paper, hand-drawn maps, and even a few pages of what looked like classical sheet music. But the one thing that every single one of these items shared was that they were completely covered in frantic, tight handwriting. The maps, the notebooks, even the margins of the sheet music were crammed with words. I sat down on a dusty trunk and started going through the papers, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The handwriting was incredibly difficult to decipher at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the sharp, hurried lettering, I was slowly able to understand. None of the pages were dated, but they seemed to be stacked in chronological order, with the older, more legible entries on top, and the newer, more chaotic entries near the bottom. I was so deeply intrigued by this hidden box and the strange papers inside that I told myself I would not go back downstairs until I had read through every single page. The earliest entries in the notebooks were honestly pretty boring. They detailed simple things like the daily weather, mundane household tasks, and random thoughts about the writer's day. It closely resembled a highly disorganized personal diary. From these early pages, I was very quickly able to gather that whoever was responsible for writing all of this was someone who had previously lived in our house a very long time ago. But as I kept reading further down the stack, the entries started getting progressively weirder. For starters, the physical handwriting became noticeably more chaotic, messy, and illegible, which was the first real indication that something was wrong. But that was absolutely nothing compared to the actual content of what I was reading. Whoever wrote these pages had become completely and totally obsessed with our attic. They began repeatedly measuring the entire space. They documented the physical dimensions of the attic over and over again, constantly comparing their measurements to the actual footprint of the house on the floors below. According to their frantic mathematical equations, the attic was significantly smaller than it should have been. The writer claimed that there was a massive discrepancy along one of the back walls, a space of several feet that simply could not be accounted for. They went into extreme, painstaking detail about this one specific wall, noting every tiny crack, indent, and nail mark. Every square inch of what made that wall distinctive was cataloged in the notes. The diary entries got even more frantic after that. Based on what I was reading, it became clear that the writer was spending hours at a time up in the attic, sometimes even sleeping up there on the hard floorboards. They claimed they had started hearing strange sounds coming from directly behind that missing wall space. They described these sounds as low scratching noises, heavy breathing, and shifting weights. To make it even more chilling, there were precise timestamps written next to some of these descriptions. One entry read, 2:14 a.m., loud scratching for approximately 3 minutes. The more I read, the more I realized that I was holding a first-hand, highly detailed account of someone's complete descent into absolute madness. There was nothing coherent about the writing toward the end. I did not believe a single word of what they were writing, thinking it was just the ramblings of a very sick person. But then the papers got even worse. The final pages of the journal did not contain sentences anymore. They were just covered in thousands of tiny tally marks. Rows and rows and rows of them, counting something that was never identified. And then the entries just abruptly stopped. Either the person had suddenly stopped writing, or that was simply as far as the record went. By the time I finished reading the very last page, I was genuinely shaking. The air in the attic suddenly felt freezing cold. I wanted nothing more than to pack everything back into the black box, put it exactly where I found it, go back downstairs, and completely purge the memory of reading it from my brain. But there was one thing I knew I had to do first. My eyes naturally drifted straight to the back wall that the writer had been so completely fixated on, and the exact moment I realized there were actual markings, cracks, and deep indents in that wall, I started feeling physically sick to my stomach. I walked over to examine the wall closely, and some of the physical cracks in the plaster seemed to line up almost perfectly with the hand-drawn sketches in the journal. It was a type of deep, psychological fear that I had never experienced before. I can only describe it as the overwhelming feeling of being watched, but from multiple different angles at the exact same time. I could suddenly picture the writer of those journals clawing at this exact wall in a fit of pure lunacy. It felt as if he were standing right there in the room with me. Suddenly, I did not want to spend another single second in that attic. I grabbed the heavy black box, climbed down the ladder as fast as I could, and went straight to my dad. When I showed him the papers, he was just as shocked and confused as I was. He had absolutely no idea what any of it meant, and he confirmed that he had never seen the black box before in his life. He looked closely at the handwriting and told me he was 100% sure it was not his father's writing, which meant that whoever wrote those entries must have been someone who lived in our house even before my grandfather. The problem was, both of my grandparents were already gone, and my dad knew absolutely nothing about the people who had owned the house before them. My dad decided to go up to the attic to investigate, and to my surprise, he told me to come with him. I felt significantly safer having him there, so I did not argue. I stood off to the side while my dad inspected the back wall much more meticulously than I had, using some of the sketches from the journal as a direct guide. After a few minutes of feeling around the wood and plaster, he suddenly froze, deep in thought. I thought he was about to give up, but he turned to me and calmly said that he was going to rip the wall down. I was actually incredibly shocked by his decision, but I was in no position to oppose him. He went down to the garage, gathered some heavy tools, and we went back up. He began tearing into the plaster and wood with a crowbar, and what we saw behind that wall was absolutely shocking. The writer of those journals had been completely right. There was a hidden space back there, and it was a lot of space. It was several feet deep, and it ran the entire length of the attic wall. But that was not even the worst part. The wooden walls of this hidden chamber were completely covered in strange markings. There were thick black lines, bizarre symbols, and geometric shapes that I did not recognize at all. They covered almost every single visible surface of the hidden room. I do not really know how to describe them, but those marks were deeply unsettling to look at. They did not look like any kind of writing or language. The implication of this discovery was actually much worse than the symbols themselves, because my dad and I very quickly realized that there was absolutely no alternative entrance to that hidden space. There were no doors, no hidden latches, and no openings from the outside of the house. So, how could anyone have ever gotten in there to paint those symbols on the walls in the first place? My dad and I just stood there in absolute silence, completely overwhelmed by what we were looking at. Eventually, once the initial shock of the discovery began to wear off, we confirmed that the hidden space was entirely empty, with the sole exception of the bizarre symbols drawn all over the walls. But the mystery did not end there. The more we sat down and thought about the entire situation, the less sense it made. At one point, my dad pointed out a major flaw in our theories. He noted that whoever wrote those frantic notebooks, whoever had been so deeply obsessed with documenting every tiny detail, did not seem like the type of person who would neatly organize their mad ramblings in a sturdy box and tuck it safely away in a corner. Compulsive, manic behavior usually does not end with tidy archival work. That thought had not occurred to me until that exact moment, but I had to admit that he was completely right. The neat preservation of those mad journals could only mean one thing. Someone else had found the writings, compiled them together, and hidden them away. My dad was 2 steps ahead of me. I watched as this unreadable, heavy look washed over his face. It was a mix of deep sadness and confusion. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he softly said that it must have been his father, my grandfather. He must have found the writings at some point, gathered them up, and stored them in that black box to keep the secret safe. There really was not much we could do after that. My dad admitted to me years later that the thought of his father withholding something so massive from him, and why he would even do such a thing in the first place, was something that would eat at his mind forever. And I really do not blame him. As for me, I still do not know what to make of any of it. It happened so long ago that I suppose it does not really matter anymore, but if I think about it for long enough, I can still easily freak myself out. I do not think anyone can truly rationalize what we found. There is no reasonable, logical explanation for it. I used to try to convince myself that whoever had written those entries was the same person who had scratched up and painted that hidden space, and that they were probably just suffering from severe mental illness. But there were details written in those pages that someone could only possibly know if they were inside the space, after the wall was already built and sealed. But with the wall being completely sealed, there was physically no way into that space. It truly makes absolutely no sense. My dad refused to let me keep the black box when we ultimately moved out of that house years later. For all I know, that box is still sitting up there in that dark attic, waiting for the next owners to find it. All I know for sure is that this is a mystery I will take with me to my grave. To give you some more context about why these spaces can be so unsettling, you have to understand my own relationship with old houses. I have been a heavy smoker for much longer than I care to admit to anyone. It has been about 23 years now, give or take a few. At this point in my life, smoking is less of a bad habit and much more of a personal daily ritual. It is just something to keep my hands busy during stressful moments, or a way to officially mark the end of a long, tiring day. But there is one strict rule that I have always kept. I absolutely refuse to smoke inside my home. My parents were the exact same way when they lived in this house, even though my dad would occasionally smoke heavy cigars on very special occasions. I ended up inheriting this entire house from them about 4 years ago, when they finally decided to pull the trigger on their retirement plans and move all the way down to Florida. They had been talking about making that move for years, and I think they just really needed to know that the family house would be in good, responsible hands before they could actually bring themselves to leave it behind. At the time, I was recently divorced, living in a rental apartment that was way too small and honestly pretty depressing, so the timing of the inheritance worked out perfectly for me. My only real complaint about the place now is that the house actually feels way too big for one person, which probably sounds like an absurd thing to complain about, until you realize that it is a massive 3-story colonial home, and I live here completely alone. The house also comes with this beautiful, sprawling backyard. It is probably close to a full acre of land if you count the heavily wooded part at the very back of the property. Over the last few years, I have gotten into the habit of taking these long, late-night walks out there in the dark while I smoke my last cigarette of the day. It is incredibly peaceful out there. There are not any close neighbors nearby to bother me, and the only light source in the entire yard is the faint glow coming from the windows of my own house. So usually it is just me, the sound of the crickets, and whatever small animals are rustling around in the trees. I usually do one full, slow loop around the entire property line, which takes about 10 minutes if I am not rushing. It has truly become my personal version of daily meditation, or perhaps just my convenient excuse to stand outside and smoke in absolute peace and quiet. But there is one very important thing that needs to be known about this property. The house itself is incredibly old. It has extremely creaky wooden floors, drafty windows, and thin walls. It is practically impossible for anyone to walk around in there without making a significant amount of noise. The house also has a large attic, which is accessed through one of those wooden pull-down ladders located in the second-floor hallway ceiling. It is essentially just a big, dusty storage room. I only ever go up there when I need to grab seasonal decorations or store some of my parents' old belongings that I do not know what to do with, but cannot bring myself to throw away. There is also a tiny, narrow window located on the back wall of the attic, which overlooks the entire backyard. It is maybe only a foot wide, original to the structure of the house, and it honestly looks a bit out of place against the rest of the architecture. I have looked up at that tiny attic window hundreds of times during my nightly walks in the yard. It had never caught my attention or seemed unusual before. That is, until about 3 weeks ago. I was doing my usual nightly loop, about halfway through a cigarette, when I happened to casually glance up at the dark house. I do not even know why I looked up. I was not thinking about the attic or anything creepy. My eyes just naturally drifted upward, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw something move directly behind that little window. I stopped walking immediately and just stood frozen in the middle of the yard, staring intently up at the attic. The window was completely dark. There is no light source up in the attic, unless you physically carry a flashlight up there, but I was almost positive that I had seen a brief flash of movement. It looked like a dark shape passing quickly in front of the glass, or perhaps something heavy shifting in the darkness just behind it. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid and ridiculous. I reasoned that I had probably just seen the reflection of a passing cloud, or maybe a bat flying close to the roof. I quickly finished my cigarette, walked back inside, and tried not to think about it anymore. But the very next night I saw it again, and this time there was absolutely no doubt in my mind. There was definitely something moving around up there behind the glass, and it was not a mere reflection or a trick of the light. Something was physically inside my attic. My very first thought was that it had to be a wild animal. Squirrels, raccoons, and birds managed to get into old houses all the time, and I would not have been surprised at all if there was a gap somewhere in the old wooden eaves. But then I started thinking about the sheer size of the movement I had seen. What kind of wild animal would be large enough for me to clearly see its silhouette from all the way down in the backyard? I did not like any of the logical answers I came up with. I went back inside the house, closed the door, and stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the dark hallway where the attic access hatch was located. I listened as closely as I could, but I did not hear any scratching, scurrying, or animal noises. I actually did not hear anything at all, which did make sense given how thick the attic floorboards were. I really did not want to go up there, but I knew I did not have a choice. If there was a large animal or something else living in my attic, I needed to know about it before it caused serious damage to the house. So, with a heavy sense of reluctance, I turned on my phone flashlight, reached up, and pulled down the creaky wooden ladder. It was an especially nerve-wracking situation, because the specific layout of the attic entrance meant that I would have to climb up blindly. If there was something lurking right next to the opening, I would not be able to see it until my head was already fully inside the room. I climbed up the wooden rungs slowly, trying my best to convince myself that I was not completely scared out of my mind, even though I was, and my fears were almost immediately justified. I was not even remotely prepared for the sight that greeted me when my flashlight beam swept across the room. It was not an animal that was up there. And it did not look like a normal person either. The entire attic was a complete chaotic disaster. I do not just mean that it was messy or dusty. I mean it had been violently destroyed. Every single cardboard box and plastic bin had been violently overturned, and their contents were strewn wildly across the floorboards. But I was not even thinking about the mess. All I could focus on was the thick black paint, or at least what looked exactly like black paint, that was violently smeared across every single wall and even across the ceiling. The paint was disturbingly thick, almost chunky in texture. But the absolute worst part by far was how wet and shiny it looked under my flashlight beam. It looked as if it had been smeared onto the wood only moments before I climbed up. It was actually still slowly dripping down the walls in several places, so I was 100% sure that it was fresh. That initial glimpse freaked me out so intensely that I genuinely lost my footing and almost fell straight off the ladder. I do not know why, but seeing that fresh dripping paint terrified me to the point that I felt like I could not breathe. My brain immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. There was a dangerous, unstable person hiding inside my house. I did one incredibly quick, panicked sweep of the attic with my flashlight to make sure there was no one standing directly in front of me, and that was more than enough for me. I practically slid down the wooden ladder in my frantic rush to get back to the safety of the second floor. But in a matter of seconds, my intense fear suddenly transformed into pure hot anger. The realization that some stranger had entered my home, destroyed my family's belongings, and was actively terrorizing me made me snap. I decided that I was going to find this person, and I was going to defend myself and my home. I started tearing through the entire house, checking every single bedroom, closet, and bathroom. But as I searched, I did not find a single trace of anyone. The more I looked without finding anything, the more discouraged and panicked I became. The initial rush of adrenaline was starting to wear off, and I was becoming much more afraid again, which certainly did not help matters. I finished clearing the lower floors, and went back upstairs to my own bedroom, thinking that maybe I had missed a potential hiding spot. But even after checking under the bed and behind the curtains, the room was completely empty. The moment I paused to take a deep breath and calm my racing heart, however, I heard it. There were two loud, distinct thumps, followed immediately by what sounded like something incredibly heavy being dragged slowly across the floor. The sounds were coming from directly above my head. It could only mean one thing. They were still up in the attic. How incredibly stupid of me. Whoever was up there had probably never even left the room. They had likely just been hiding silently behind one of the giant, overturned storage boxes while I did my quick flashlight sweep. I do not know where the sudden courage came from, but something inside me just snapped. This was my parents' house, a place of safety, and whoever was up there had completely violated it. Before I could talk myself out of it, I ran downstairs to the kitchen and grabbed the largest, sharpest carving knife I could find. And you best believe that I was fully ready to use it to protect myself. I ran back upstairs, stood under the hatch, and pulled the wooden ladder down once again. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely keep a solid grip on the wooden rungs, but I forced my feet to keep climbing, and then I just started screaming like a complete lunatic. I burst through the attic opening, yelling at the top of my lungs, waving the heavy kitchen knife around in the air like a madman. Part of it was an attempt to intimidate whoever was up there, but honestly, most of it was just pure, unadulterated fear. I stomped around the creaky floorboards as aggressively as I possibly could, kicking over empty boxes and screaming for them to show themselves. But there was absolutely no one up there. I was completely sure of it this time. My attic is not that large. It is just one big open space with no hidden rooms, so there was quite literally nowhere left for a human being to hide. There was something else up there, though. Something brand new that had not been there during my first climb, and seeing it completely killed every single ounce of bravery I had managed to scrape together. There were fresh, deep scratch marks everywhere. Long, violent gouges had been carved deep into the wooden support beams and floorboards, looking exactly as if a large, powerful animal had been clawing at them with immense force. The black paint from before was still wet, but these deep scratches were layered directly over the top of the wet paint, tearing through it. After seeing those fresh gouges, I was completely done. I ran down the ladder, rushed into the first-floor bathroom, locked the heavy door behind me, and frantically dialed 911. The police arrived at my house maybe 15 minutes later, which felt like hours. Two of the responding officers went upstairs with their guns drawn to thoroughly check the attic, while I waited downstairs in the kitchen with the third officer. When they finally came back down the stairs, they looked incredibly puzzled. All they could tell me was that the attic was completely empty. They also mentioned that they had checked the entire perimeter of the roof and walls, and they could not find any gaps, holes, or open windows where an animal or a person could have entered. They suggested that whoever had vandalized my property must have simply snuck out through the front or back door while I was upstairs. But I insisted to the officers that their explanation was physically impossible. The house is incredibly old and creaky, as I said before. Even the lightest step from a small person is enough to make a loud noise that echoes through the entire house. There is absolutely no way someone could have run down the stairs and out the door without me hearing them, especially since I was hyper-vigilant. But there was nothing else the officers could do, and no other explanations they could offer me. They wrote up a standard police report, told me to keep my doors locked, and they left. It has been 3 weeks since that terrifying night, and luckily there have not been any further incidents. So I suppose I have no choice but to try and believe the official story. I have to try and convince myself that some random homeless person somehow snuck into my attic, decided to vandalize it with wet paint for some unknown reason, and then managed to escape the house without making a single sound. But the problem is, I do not believe that story. I really don't. I do not know what to make of all this, but I refuse to believe that a normal human being caused all of that damage. It feels like something much worse, something far more sinister than that. I still have not been back up to the attic since that night, not even to clean up the wet paint or organize the boxes. I really do not know what to do. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Justin had been hiking solo for about 6 years. Over those 6 years, he had built up a massive amount of confidence in his outdoor survival skills. He felt so comfortable in the deep wilderness that he did not even feel the need to stick to the main, marked trails anymore. He liked the feeling of raw nature. He liked the challenge of navigating through areas that had not been sanitized for tourists, with wooden signs and flat, paved paths. He wanted to experience real solitude. But as it turned out, this confidence was exactly what was going to get him into one of the most terrifying situations of his life. This happened last October in the Monongahela National Forest, which is located in the rugged mountains of West Virginia. Justin had driven all the way up from his home in Virginia for a long 3-day weekend. His plan was to hit some of the most remote, untouched sections of the forest. The kind of places that did not see any regular foot traffic from casual hikers. The weather on the day he set out was absolutely perfect. It was in the mid-50s, overcast, but there was no rain in the forecast. It was the ideal setting for a long, quiet hike through the autumn woods. Justin parked his car at a small dirt pull-off, grabbed his backpack, checked his supplies, and set off into the dense trees. For the first 4 hours, everything went exactly as planned. He was enjoying the crisp air, the smell of the damp earth, and the complete silence of the forest. He felt a deep sense of peace that he only ever found when he was completely alone in nature. But then, he reached what he could only describe as a massive gorge. This gorge was not some giant canyon, but it was still incredibly dangerous. It was a drop of about 30 to 40 feet down to a rocky bottom with a small creek running through it. Justin stood at the edge and looked down. He knew that if he fell, it might not kill him instantly, but he would definitely break some bones. And looking at the walls of the gorge, they were covered in loose shale and steep overhangs. It looked completely impossible to climb back up if he fell. As Justin looked around for a way to cross, he noticed a massive fallen oak tree. This tree was wedged tightly between both sides of the gorge, sitting at a slight angle. It was a very thick tree, and the bark on top had been worn down completely smooth. It looked like the weather, and probably some other adventurous hikers over the years, had used it as a natural bridge. Justin walked up to the edge of the tree. He spent a few minutes inspecting it, pushing on it, and making sure it was sturdy. It felt rock solid, so he decided to cross. He took his time, placing one foot carefully in front of the other. He kept his eyes focused directly on the wood beneath him, maintaining his balance. Within a couple of minutes, he successfully reached the other side. When his boots hit the solid ground on the opposite bank, he felt a huge rush of adrenaline. It was that classic feeling of conquering a challenge, but just as he was taking a deep breath to enjoy the moment, he heard a sound behind him. It was a rhythmic, heavy thunking sound. Justin spun around. On the other side of the gorge, standing about 10 feet away from where the fallen oak tree met the bank, was a man. This man looked to be in his 50s. He was wearing a ratty, faded camouflage jacket and a pair of old, dirty blue jeans. He had a very long, scraggly beard that gave him the appearance of a stereotypical lumberjack. But what caught Justin's attention, and what made his heart completely skip a beat, was what the man was holding in his hands. He was holding a full-sized, heavy-duty axe. At first, Justin thought maybe the man actually was a local woodcutter. But then, without saying a single word, the man walked right up to the base of the fallen oak tree. He raised the axe over his shoulder, and he began to swing it violently into the trunk of the tree. Justin was completely stunned. He stood there on the opposite side of the gorge, just watching this strange man hack away at the only bridge. Justin yelled across the gorge, asking the man what the hell he was doing. But the man did not even look up. He did not blink. He just kept swinging the axe, burying the blade deep into the wood with a loud, echoey thud. Then, Justin watched in absolute horror as one of the man's swings landed incredibly deep. The massive oak tree actually shifted slightly. The wood let out a loud, sickening crack. Justin realized that he was in serious trouble. He yelled even louder, screaming at the man to stop. He explained that he had literally just crossed the gorge on that very tree, and that he needed to get back. But as Justin was screaming, a terrifying realization dawned on him. The man already knew that. The man had probably watched him cross, and now, he was actively trying to destroy the bridge, so Justin would be completely stranded on the other side of the deep gorge. The man showed absolutely no signs of slowing down. He just kept swinging. Out of pure frustration and growing panic, Justin began to scream increasingly nasty insults across the water. He was saying anything he could think of to get the man to look at him. Finally, Justin yelled that he was going to have to cross back over right now, so the man had better step aside. That was the moment the man finally stopped. He slowly lowered the axe. He turned his head and looked directly at Justin. His voice was incredibly calm, almost casual, as if they were just talking about the weather. He looked at Justin and said, "That is not my problem." This casual tone made Justin incredibly angry. He lost his temper completely. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, hurling insults at the man. In hindsight, Justin would later admit that this was a very bad idea. Something Justin said must have hit a nerve, because the man's expression suddenly changed. He slowly set the heavy axe down on the ground. Then he took a few slow, deliberate steps toward the very edge of the gorge. Now that the man was closer, Justin could see his face clearly, and it was deeply unsettling. The man's eyes were incredibly sunken and dark. In fact, the skin all around his eyes was dark, almost black, like he had not slept in weeks or was suffering from some kind of sickness. The man leaned slightly over the edge of the gorge. stared directly into Justin's eyes, and said something Justin would never forget. He said, "I know these woods a lot better than you do." The way the man said it was not an angry shout. It was a cold, quiet statement of fact. It was an absolute promise. The two men stood there, staring at each other across the gap. The silence between them felt like it lasted forever. Then, without another word, the man bent down, picked up his axe, turned around, and walked back into the thick trees. Within seconds, he was completely gone. Justin was left standing there, trying to process what had just happened. He looked down at the tree. It was still wedged in place, but it was clearly ruined. The side where the man had been chopping was splintered, cracked, and completely unstable. There was no way Justin was going to risk his life trying to walk across it now. He pulled out his cell phone, hoping to call for help, but there was absolutely zero service. He was completely on his own. At this point, Justin decided to cut his trip short. He was incredibly angry, but more than that, he was deeply spooked. He decided to start walking downstream, following the edge of the gorge. His logic was simple. If he walked far enough, he would eventually find a spot where the gorge narrowed, or a place where he could safely climb down and cross over to the other side. That way, he could loop back to his car. But this turned out to be a massive mistake. Justin walked for over an hour. Instead of getting shallower, the gorge only seemed to get deeper and steeper. The gap between the two sides was actually widening. Every time he turned a corner, hoping to see an easy crossing, he was met with nothing but impossible, vertical rocky terrain. To make matters worse, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The temperature was dropping fast, and the woods were getting dark. Justin started to panic. He was miles away from his vehicle, walking in the exact opposite direction of where he needed to go. He even started to think about climbing down the steep cliffs, despite knowing how incredibly dangerous that would be. Just as the panic was starting to take over, Justin stumbled upon a small clearing in the trees. In the middle of the clearing, there was a makeshift campsite. There was a fire pit made of stones, and looking closely, Justin could see that the ashes inside were fresh. It looked like it had been used very recently. For a split second, Justin felt a rush of relief. He thought maybe another hiker or camper was nearby and they could help him. But as he stepped closer, that relief instantly turned into dread. The entire campsite was wrong. He looked at the surrounding trees and noticed strange carvings in the bark. These were not normal trail markers or initials. They were deep, jagged gouges that formed bizarre symbols he had never seen before. Then he looked up at the branches. Hanging from the limbs were weird, rusted metal tools, old pieces of dirty cloth tied into tight knots, and what looked like small animal bones arranged in deliberate, geometric patterns. It looked like some kind of strange, dark ritual site. As soon as Justin realized what he was looking at, his survival instincts kicked in. He turned around and immediately started to walk away as fast as he could. He was twice as scared now as he had been just minutes before. And then, things got much worse. As Justin was walking away from the campsite, he started to hear a sound behind him. It was a faint, rhythmic crunching of dry leaves. Footsteps. Something was stalking him. Justin stopped in his tracks and spun around. But the moment he stopped, the sound stopped too. The woods were dead silent. He started walking again, and within a few seconds, the footsteps started back up. He tried to tell himself it was just a wild animal, like a bear or a deer. But the footsteps sounded incredibly heavy and deliberate. They were matching his exact pace. Justin began to walk faster. He was hoping that whatever was behind him would lose interest and walk away. But instead, the sounds only got louder, and they were definitely getting closer. Then came the moment that Justin still has nightmares about to this day. He decided to look over his shoulder one more time, and as he did, he caught a quick glimpse of a figure ducking behind a thick tree trunk. It was a person. Justin froze. His eyes scanned the dark trees, and that is when he realized the terrifying truth. There was not just one person behind him. Further out to his left, he saw another dark silhouette moving through the shadows. They had fanned out. They were herding him, driving him in a specific direction. Once the figures realized that Justin had spotted them, they stopped trying to be stealthy. They started moving openly, stepping heavily through the brush. Justin looked closely at the figure on his left and saw that the person was carrying a long, heavy object. It looked like a metal pipe or a club. That was the breaking point. Justin did not think twice. He turned and began to run at full speed. The moment he started running, the figures behind him burst into a full sprint, chasing him down. The sheer terror of that moment was indescribable. Justin was lost in the middle of a massive forest. The sun had almost completely set, and he was being actively hunted by multiple armed individuals. The adrenaline pumping through his system was the only thing keeping his legs moving. He ran faster than he ever had in his entire life. As he ran, one of the people behind him let out a blood-curdling scream. It was not a scream of pain, and it did not contain any actual words. It was a loud, aggressive war cry. It echoed through the dark woods, sending a chill straight down Justin's spine. He kept his head down and kept running. The deep, dark gorge was still running parallel to his left side. His lungs were burning, his muscles were screaming for oxygen, and he knew he could not keep up this pace for much longer. Just as his body was starting to give out from pure exhaustion, he saw something up ahead. It was another fallen tree. This one was much smaller and thinner than the massive oak tree from earlier, but Justin did not have a choice. He could hear the heavy footsteps of his pursuers closing in. Without stopping to think, Justin jumped onto the log. He began to scramble across the gap, balancing precariously over the dark drop below. He did not even know if the tree could support his weight. He was literally betting his entire life on a single piece of dead wood. He was so tired and shaking so violently that he was certain he was going to slip and fall to his death. But somehow, the log held. He scrambled off the other side and collapsed onto the solid ground. He immediately turned around to look back across the gorge. Emerging from the trees on the opposite side were three men. To Justin's horror, they looked like carbon copies of the first man he had encountered. They were filthy, wearing ragged clothing, and one of them was holding a long metal pipe. They stood at the edge of the gap, glaring at him. The first man stepped up to the log, putting his hand on it as if he was about to cross over and continue the chase, but then he paused. He looked down at the unstable log, then looked back up at Justin. The three men stood there, staring across at him with cold, menacing eyes. Justin was too terrified to move. Then the man with the pipe pointed at Justin and shouted, "Get the hell out of here, you got lucky." That was all Justin needed to hear. He scrambled to his feet, turned around, and ran. He kept waiting to hear the sound of footsteps behind him, but the forest had suddenly gone completely silent. The darkness was almost total now, and Justin had to use the faint glow of his phone screen to guide his steps. He was sobbing, fighting off a complete mental breakdown, but he kept moving. By some absolute miracle, Justin eventually stumbled upon the main trailhead. He had run at an angle that brought him right back to where he had parked his car hours earlier. He jumped into his vehicle, slammed his hands on the steering wheel, locked the doors, and drove straight home. He reported everything he could to the local authorities when he got back. But deep down, he knew there was very little they could do in that massive, dense forest. It was just too big of an area to search, and they did not have any names. It has been months since that day, and while Justin still goes hiking, he admits that it is not the same. The joy is gone. Every time he hears a twig snap or sees a shadow move in the trees, his heart jumps, and he is right back in those woods, running for his life. But as bad as Justin's experience was, there are other forests in this country that hold secrets that are perhaps even more difficult to explain. This next story took place 3 years ago, in the dense wilderness of northern Minnesota. The man in this story had been an avid outdoorsman his entire life. Just like Justin, he always preferred the raw, untouched wilderness. He hated the sanitized version of nature that you get on popular trails with their neat wooden signs and heavily worn paths. He liked to go deep off the grid, where it was just him and the woods. On this particular day, he had been hiking for about 4 hours when he stopped and looked around, and he realized that nothing looked familiar. He had lost his bearings. Now, this is something that happens to experienced hikers from time to time, and usually, it is not a big deal. You just take a moment, look at the sun, and orient yourself. But this time, a cold feeling of dread began to pool in his stomach. No matter which way he looked, the trees seemed to blend together into a wall of green and brown. He tried to remain calm. He told himself that if he just kept walking in a straight line, he would eventually hit a road or a trail. But as he started walking, he heard a sound. It was a light rustling in the dry brush behind him. At first, he stopped walking. The moment he stopped, the rustling stopped too. He took a deep breath, told himself it was just a squirrel or a bird, and took a few steps forward. The rustling started right back up. This went on for several minutes. Every time the hiker stopped, the sound stopped. Every time he walked, the sound followed him, matching his exact pace. He kept telling himself it was probably just a deer, but deep down he knew that wild deer do not stalk humans like that. He was being followed, and then, all at once, the light rustling turned into a heavy, fast movement all around him. Before he could even process what was happening, the hiker found himself standing in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides. Emerging from the thick brush were 6 or 7 massive timber wolves. Some of them were low to the ground, baring their teeth and letting out deep, rumbling snarls. Others were just standing perfectly still, staring at him with cold, hungry eyes. It was very clear to him that to them he was a meal. The hiker knew he was in a desperate situation. He slowly reached down and pulled out his hunting knife, holding it out in front of him. But he knew the math. One man with a knife stood absolutely no chance against a coordinated pack of wolves. He stood there, terrified, thinking to himself that this was the end. He was going to die alone in the cold Minnesota woods. All because he was too stubborn to stick to the marked trails. He was trying to decide whether he should make himself look big and scream, or just stand perfectly still, when suddenly, something bizarre happened. Every single wolf in the pack went completely rigid at the exact same moment. It was not a gradual reaction. It was instant. Their ears shot up, their snarls stopped, and every single one of them turned their heads to look in the exact same direction, somewhere over the hiker's shoulder. And then the wolves ran. They did not just wander off. They turned and sprinted away at full speed, crashing through the brush in the opposite direction, looking incredibly terrified. It was as if they were the ones being hunted by something far more dangerous. The hiker was left standing there completely alone. At first he felt a rush of relief, but very quickly that relief was replaced by a deep, hollow sense of dread. The first thing he noticed was the sound, or rather, the complete lack of it. The entire forest had gone dead silent. There was no wind rustling the leaves. There were no birds chirping. There were no insects buzzing. It was as if someone had suddenly flipped a master switch and muted the entire world. The light in the woods seemed to change too. It was still daytime, but everything looked dimmer, slightly out of focus. It was the exact kind of tunnel vision you get right before you are about to pass out. But the worst part by far was the realization of why the wolves had run away. Wolves are apex predators. Very few things in the forest can scare an entire pack into a panicked retreat. Whatever was standing in the woods behind him must have been incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous. The hiker knew he had to keep moving, but he was completely disoriented. He had a choice to make. He could follow the direction the wolves had run, which might lead him further into the unknown and run the risk of getting surrounded again. Or he could continue in the direction he had originally been walking, which meant walking directly toward whatever had just terrified the wolf pack. It was an impossible choice. In the end, he decided to keep going forward, toward the source of the wolves' fear. His logic was that if he turned back, he would waste hours of precious daylight and end up stuck in the woods after dark. He decided to bite his tongue and walk forward while he still had some light. About 20 minutes later, he saw a clearing up ahead. As he approached, he thought he might have found an old campsite. He could see what looked like a circle of stones on the ground. But as he stepped into the clearing, he realized that this was not a normal campsite at all. Carved into the trunks of the trees surrounding the clearing were deep, intentional symbols. They were not trailblazes or random markings. They were complex, geometric patterns that looked ancient and strange. Hanging from the tree branches on thin, leather cords were bizarre items. There were small, delicate bones, likely from birds or rodents, tied together in patterns. There were also pieces of rusted, twisted metal that looked incredibly old. The hiker noted that just looking at the shapes of the metal made his eyes feel strained, as if his brain could not quite comprehend what it was seeing. In the center of the clearing was the stone ring. But the stones were not just laid out in a circle. They were delicately stacked on top of one another, forming miniature, unstable towers. Inside the stone ring there was no wood. Instead, there were pieces of old cloth, strange metallic jewelry, and other unidentifiable objects. But the thing that made the hiker's heart stop was the smoke. Hanging in the air, exactly 6 feet off the ground, was a thick cloud of jet black smoke. It was not rising, it was not drifting with the wind. It was just hovering there, perfectly still, like a solid object, and looking down at the stone ring, there was no fire. The ashes were cold and did not look like they had been used in a very long time. The smoke was coming from absolutely nothing. The hiker stood at the edge of the clearing, completely frozen. He could not tear his eyes away from that black smoke. As he stared at it, he experienced a very strange physical sensation. He felt as though he was no longer actually standing in the clearing. It felt as though he was looking through a window at the scene, like he was standing inside his own home, looking out into the yard, rather than being physically present in the woods. At the same time, a heavy feeling of grief and terror began to build in his chest. It was an overwhelming sadness, as if his body was mourning some terrible tragedy that had not even happened yet. He stood there, staring at the unmoving smoke for what felt like 5 minutes. Before his brain finally kicked back into gear, he turned around and he ran. He did not walk, he did not jog. He sprinted with every ounce of strength he had left. He was completely consumed by a primal instinctive fear. He did not know what he was running from, but his gut told him that if he stayed in those woods for one more minute, he would never leave. After that, his memory becomes incredibly foggy. He remembers running, and then, the next thing he knew, it was completely dark. He had been running and wandering in the woods for hours without any memory of it. He was drenched in sweat, but at the same time he was freezing cold. Up ahead he saw the headlights of his car. He ran to the vehicle, jumped inside, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. The hiker never reported what he saw. He did not even know what he would say to the police. Over the years, he has tried to research what he experienced, but he has found no answers. When he finally told his father about the incident, his father just looked at him and said that everyone who spends enough time in the wilderness eventually has that one experience that they cannot explain. And for this hiker, that was his experience. He still thinks about the wolves, the campsite, and the black smoke. But the thing that terrifies him the most is the memory loss. He cannot help but wonder what happened to him during those lost hours in the dark Minnesota woods. These two stories show us how dangerous and strange the deep woods can be when you are entirely alone. But sometimes, even when you are with a group of friends, and even when you are armed, the wilderness can still find a way to terrify you. This final story happened several years ago. During the month of February, the narrator of this story and his friends were experienced campers. Back when they were teenagers, they loved nothing more than going out into the woods on the weekends. Once they got their driver's licenses at 16, they were constantly exploring new spots. Because they often went to very remote areas, the narrator's father wanted to make sure they were safe. So, he allowed them to borrow one of his personal handguns for protection. It was a Taurus G2C. By the time they were 18 and seniors in high school, they had planned a major backpacking trip. The group consisted of the narrator, his girlfriend Megan, his best friend Colin, and his girlfriend Anne. Their destination was the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. They wanted to hike deep into the mountains to see some of the beautiful natural waterfalls. It was a long 9-hour drive from their hometown, so they left early in the morning and arrived at the trailhead around 7 o'clock in the evening. Since it was already dark and they were exhausted from the drive, they decided to set up camp at one of the designated campsites near the parking lot for the night. They set up 2 tents. The narrator and Megan shared one, while Colin and Anne shared the other. The narrator made sure to keep the loaded Taurus G2C handgun close by in his tent. The first night passed without any issues, and everyone slept well. The next morning, they woke up early, cooked a quick breakfast, and drove to the start of the deep wilderness trail. Their plan was to hike out to a remote waterfall, enjoy the scenery, and then find a quiet off-trail spot to set up camp for the night. As they were hiking along the trail toward the waterfall, Anne suddenly stopped. She looked back over her shoulder with a worried expression. She whispered to the group that she thought someone was following them. She said she had seen a man standing perfectly still in the trees, staring at them, but every time she looked back, he had moved closer. The group stopped and scanned the surrounding forest. Sure enough, just a short distance away, they spotted a man standing behind a tree, watching them. The moment he realized he had been spotted, the man spun around and quickly ran away into the brush. Colin, wanting to show off and reassure his girlfriend, yelled out into the woods, telling the man to back off, or they would kick his ass. They were all fairly athletic and felt confident they could defend themselves if it came down to it. They shrugged it off, assuming it was just a strange local, and continued their hike. They did not see the man again for the rest of the afternoon. Eventually, they reached the waterfall. It was beautiful, and they spent about 2 hours taking pictures, eating lunch, and enjoying the view. By the time they decided to head out and find a campsite, the sun was starting to get low in the sky. As they were walking through the trees, looking for a flat piece of ground to pitch their tents, the narrator suddenly stopped. He pointed toward a ridge a short distance away. Standing on the ridge, staring down at them, was a woman, but she did not look normal. She was incredibly tall and thin. The narrator estimated that she had to be at least 6 feet, 5 inches tall. Her proportions looked completely off, and she was just standing there, silently watching them with a blank expression on her face. Everyone in the group felt an instant wave of unease. The narrator yelled up at the woman, telling her to leave them alone. He shouted that they were armed and had a gun. The tall woman did not say anything. She simply turned around and slowly walked away into the trees. The group was thoroughly creeped out. They had no idea if this strange woman was connected to the man they had seen earlier, but they decided they did not want to camp anywhere near this area. They packed up their gear and hiked for another hour, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the two strangers as possible. Eventually, they found a beautiful, secluded spot next to a small flowing creek. The creek pooled into a relatively deep, clear pond. It looked like the perfect place to relax and forget about the weird encounters. They stripped down, jumped into the water, and spent some time splashing around and laughing. They joked about the strange people they had seen, laughing it off and deciding they were probably just local hillbillies on drugs. When the sun began to set, they got out of the water to prepare dinner. They had brought plenty of food for the trip. The narrator began to grill chicken breasts over the campfire, while Colin helped boil rice, vegetables, and potatoes. They ate a hearty meal, and then they decided to open some of the alcohol they had packed in. The narrator, who was a regular smoker, rolled up some weed, and the group sat around the campfire, drinking, smoking, and telling jokes. Before long, they were all highly intoxicated. At one point, Colin laughed so hard that he literally fell out of his camp chair and just lay on the grass, giggling. It was a great night, and they felt completely safe. Late into the night, they finally crawled into their respective tents. The narrator and Megan were in their tent, talking quietly, when suddenly they heard a sound outside. It was a faint, low chuckle. Then it turned into a loud, mocking laugh. The narrator immediately assumed it was Colin playing a prank on them. He sat up and yelled out, asking what was so funny. But a second later, Colin's voice called out from the other tent, sounding completely terrified. Colin yelled, "That wasn't me." The narrator felt his blood run cold. The alcohol and weed instantly wore off, replaced by pure adrenaline. He grabbed the Taurus G2C from his pack, unzipped the tent door, and stepped out into the dark night. He could hear rustling in the bushes nearby. Without hesitating, the narrator raised the gun and fired 3 warning shots into the air, screaming at the top of his lungs for whoever was out there to leave them alone, or the next bullet would be for them. The loud cracks of the gunshots echoed through the valley. A moment later, they heard the heavy sound of someone running away through the dry brush. The group was too terrified to sleep. They moved their tents as close together as possible, and they agreed to take turns staying awake as a lookout for the rest of the night. Fortunately, the rest of the night passed in silence. The next morning, they had a serious discussion about whether they should pack up and go home early, but in the end, they decided to stay. They figured that the gunshots had definitely scared off whoever was harassing them, and they did not want to ruin their expensive trip. However, they did decide to move closer to the exit. They planned to hike to a spot about 3 miles away from the parking lot, set up camp for one final night, and then head home the following morning. They packed up their camp and began the hike back toward the trailhead. Along the way, they ran into a couple of other hikers. They stopped to chat and warned them about the strange people in the woods. The other hikers seemed concerned, but they continued on their way. The narrator noted that despite the parking lot being full of cars when they arrived, these were the only other people they had seen on the trails all weekend. By the late afternoon, they had hiked about 6 miles and were now located roughly 3 miles from the nearest exit. They found a nice clearing, set up their tents, and cooked a delicious dinner of steak and potatoes. They had a few drinks and smoked, trying to ease their lingering tension before finally heading to bed. In the middle of the night, the narrator woke up with a full bladder. He tried to ignore it, but he knew he had to step outside. Because of what had happened the night before, he made sure to grab the loaded handgun before unzipping the tent. He stepped out into the freezing night air, walked a few feet away from the tent, and began to pee. Just as he was finishing up, he heard the distinct sound of leaves crunching directly behind him. His heart stopped. He quickly pulled up his pants, turned around, and switched on his high-powered headlamp. The bright beam of light sliced through the pitch-black darkness, and there, standing just 20 feet away, was the man from the day before. This time the narrator could see him clearly. He had long, greasy black hair, an incredibly thin and lanky frame, and a wild, crazed look in his eyes. But the most terrifying detail was what he was holding in his right hand. He was holding a massive, rusted machete. Before the narrator could even scream, the man raised the machete and began to charge directly at him. The narrator did not hesitate. He raised the Taurus G2C, aimed it at the charging man, and began squeezing the trigger. He fired shot after shot into the darkness. He must have hit the man, because he heard a sharp yell of pain, followed by the heavy sound of a body collapsing into the dirt and leaves. By this time, the gunshots had woken up Megan, Colin, and Anne. They scrambled out of their tents, screaming and asking what had happened. The narrator, white as a sheet, yelled at them to pack up their essential gear immediately. He told them they needed to run. They did not even bother trying to fold up the tents. They just grabbed their backpacks, turned on their flashlights, and began to sprint down the trail toward the parking lot. They ran the final 3 miles in absolute panic, expecting to hear footsteps behind them at any moment. They made it to their cars in under an hour. They threw their bags into the trunk, jumped inside, locked the doors, and sat there, panting and shaking. They decided it was too dangerous to drive on the dark, winding mountain roads in their exhausted state, so they covered the windows with blankets and spent the rest of the night sleeping in the car. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, they drove out of the mountains and stopped at a small diner in a nearby town to get some warm food and collect their thoughts. They sat in a corner booth, staring down at their coffee cups in complete silence. They talked about whether they should call the police. But the narrator was terrified that he might be charged with a crime for shooting the man. And honestly, they all felt that the man's life was not worth the risk of getting caught up in a legal battle. So, they made a pact to never speak of it, and they drove home. It has been years since that night, and the narrator has never seen any news reports about a body being found in those mountains. But he still wonders if that man survived, and if he and that tall woman are still out there, waiting in the shadows of the Ozarks for their next victims. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On July 15, 1976, a typical summer day was unfolding in the small town of Chowchilla, California. It was the kind of close-knit community where everyone knew each other and kids could play outside without their parents worrying. Around 4 o'clock, a school bus driver named Ed Ray was driving 26 students from Dairyland Elementary School back home. They had just spent a wonderful day on a summer class trip to the swimming pool at the Chowchilla Fairgrounds. Ed was a humble rancher who did this job because he loved the community. He was a stocky man about 55 years old, and a guy you would not want to pick a fight with. But to the kids, he was a gentle, patient soul they could always rely on. On this day, the bus was incredibly rowdy. The kids were excited, laughing, and still damp from swimming. Some of them were even singing. But as the bus turned onto Avenue 21, Ed noticed a white Dodge van blocking the road with its doors open. He tried to weave around the empty van, but a man in overalls with a pantyhose covering his face suddenly jumped out in front of the bus. Holding a revolver, the man walked up to the driver's side window and calmly asked Ed to open the door. Ed, wanting to keep the kids safe, opened it. Two more identically dressed men jumped in. One pointed a rifle at Ed and ordered everyone to the back. The man without the rifle drove the bus, while the man with the revolver followed in the van. They drove about a mile and parked in a bamboo thicket near the Chowchilla River. The entire ride was silent and terrifying. Once they stopped, 12 kids were moved into the white van. Ed and the remaining 14 kids were forced into the back of a second green van. This green van had a solid partition separating the driver's seat from the back, and all the windows were sealed shut. For 11 hours, Ed and the kids sat in total darkness and extreme heat. To keep the younger children calm, some of the older kids started to sing songs in the dark, including the song "If You're Happy and You Know It." Back in town, parents began to worry when the bus was just 15 minutes late. Ed was always on time. Within an hour, news of the missing bus spread, and parents helped police trace the route. By that evening, they found the abandoned bus in the bamboo thicket. The FBI was called, and 30 agents arrived on the scene to start a massive search. Meanwhile, late that night, the vans finally stopped at a rock quarry in Livermore, which was about 100 miles away. It was 3:30 in the morning, and Ed had been awake for over 24 hours. When the back doors opened, two of the captors were waiting. Ed was ordered out first. They handed him a flashlight, told him to strip off his clothes, and ordered him down a ladder into a hole. As the children were let out one by one, their names were written down for a roll call. Each child was forced to undress and climb down the ladder into what turned out to be an old moving van buried 12 feet underground. Ed immediately worried that the ceiling would cave in or that they would all suffocate. There were 2 air hoses running to the surface, some mattresses on the floor, some water jugs, Wonder Bread, peanut butter, potato chips, and holes cut into the floor for toilets. Once everyone was inside, a captor yelled down that they would be back. Then they slid a steel plate over the opening. Immediately after, the children heard heavy thuds on top of the van. The captors were shoveling dirt on top of the trailer, burying them alive. Panic broke out inside the dark space. Ed did his best to keep everyone calm. He and a 14-year-old boy named Michael Marshall tried to push against the heavy lid, but it was impossible to move. Ed instructed everyone to eat some food and get some rest. 12 hours later, the food was gone, and the ventilation system stopped working. The hot July air filled the tight space, and the roof began to cave in. Ed knew they were running out of time. Ed and Michael piled up the mattresses to reach the roof. The escape hatch was blocked by a heavy sheet of metal and weighted down with 2 100-pound industrial batteries. For hours, Ed and Michael wedged the lid open with a piece of wood and moved the heavy batteries. They dug through the remaining dirt and finally broke through to the surface. It had been 16 hours since they were buried. They walked to the quarry's guard shack, where a security guard called the police. When the police arrived at the guard shack, they immediately saw how severely dehydrated and exhausted the children and Ed Ray were. They had been trapped in extreme heat with barely any clean water, and their skin was caked in thick dirt and sweat from their desperate escape attempt. The officers did not waste any time. They loaded everyone into patrol cars and rushed them to the Santa Rita Rehabilitation Center, which was the nearest secure county facility. There, nurses and medical staff evaluated each person. They handed out clean clothes, warm meals, and plenty of water. The children were finally reunited with their frantic parents, who had spent the last 36 hours thinking they would never see their sons and daughters alive again. As soon as the children were safe, the local sheriff and the FBI turned their full attention to the rock quarry. They knew the kidnappers had to have intimate knowledge of the property to bury a giant moving van 12 feet underground without anyone noticing. It was not long before investigators discovered that the quarry was owned by a wealthy local man. When they looked closer, they found that his son, Frederick Newhall Woods, and 2 of his friends, James and Richard Schoenfeld, had been deep in debt. Investigators executed a search warrant on the property and found a draft of a ransom note demanding $5 million from the state. They also found physical evidence linking the 3 men directly to the purchase of the green and white vans. At the trial, they were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Richard was paroled in 2012, James was paroled in 2015, and Frederick Woods was finally granted parole in March of this year. Many people in Chowchilla and around the country were deeply upset that these men were ever allowed to walk free after committing such a monstrous crime. Ed Ray passed away in 2012, but he is still remembered as a hero who saved 26 lives. While the Chowchilla story is famous, there are other terrifying encounters on school buses that rarely make the national news. One of these occurred on October 20, 1995, in a rural area of Virginia. A 14-year-old high school student named Donald, who wished to have his last name left out of the public record, was riding a school bus back from a band field trip. He played in the school band and had spent the entire day participating in a big regional music competition. The bus driver was a friendly man named Bob, who was well liked by all the teenagers on board. He loved his job and was always happy to chat with the students. It was around 10 o'clock at night when the event finished, and they began the 45-minute drive back to the high school. The bus was traveling down Route 58, a quiet highway surrounded by thick woods. There were almost no other cars on the road. Soon, the students in the back of the bus noticed a car driving incredibly close to their bumper. Bob tried to change lanes to let the aggressive driver pass, but the car simply stayed right behind them, tailgating them dangerously. Eventually, the car sped past the bus in the right lane, and some of the kids shouted out the windows at the driver until their chaperone told them to stop. Donald figured it was just an angry driver and that the incident was over. But just a few minutes later, the bus suddenly slammed on its brakes so hard that the students were nearly thrown from their seats. The brakes let out a loud, piercing shriek. The bus came to a dead stop in the middle of the dark highway. Bob put the bus into reverse for a brief moment, then shifted back into drive and stopped again. He turned around and yelled for everyone to stay quiet and not to panic. His tense voice made everyone nervous. Suddenly, the students heard men shouting outside. The bus doors hissed open, and two men wearing black pullover masks and carrying handguns stepped onto the bus. The armed men yelled at everyone to shut up. They told the teenagers to empty their wallets of all their cash and hand over any jewelry they were wearing. They began moving down the aisle, pointing their guns directly at the terrified students. Donald later recalled looking down the barrel of a gun at just 14 years old. He felt completely frozen, knowing that one wrong move could end his life right there. The robbers were hurried and anxious, likely worried that another vehicle would drive by on the highway. Before they even reached the back of the bus, they took what they had gathered and ran out the door. They jumped into their car and sped away down Route 58 with the headlights turned off. Their license plates had been covered up, proving this was a carefully planned ambush. Following the armed robbery on Route 58, the community was left in shock. Bob, the beloved bus driver, felt guilty for opening the doors, even though he had no choice. The police set up roadblocks, but since the robbers had covered their license plates, there were very few clues to follow. Donald and his classmates returned to school, but they were deeply shaken, constantly checking behind them on every bus ride. Another shocking incident occurred more recently, this past February, on a dark stretch of the N4 highway in Witbank, South Africa. A school bus was carrying 4 teachers and a driver back from an athletics competition. There were no students on board at the time. What the teachers did not know was that a gang of robbers had deliberately placed large, heavy rocks across the highway, hoping to disable passing vehicles so they could rob the passengers. The bus hit the rocks at high speed, immediately rupturing a tire. The driver had no choice but to pull over onto the dark shoulder of the road. As soon as the bus stopped, 3 men rushed out from the darkness. 2 of them were armed with handguns, and the third held a large knife. They forced their way onto the bus and began demanding everyone's valuables. The criminals took cell phones, cash, jewelry, and even a smartwatch. During the robbery, one of the men struck the bus driver in the face with the butt of a gun, causing a minor injury to his jaw. Once they had stolen everything they could find, the robbers disappeared back into the night. Sometime later, a passing tow driver pulled over to help them. One of the teachers used the tow truck driver's phone to call her fiancé, who then contacted the police. Although an investigation was launched immediately, the robbers have still not been caught. Local school officials in Witbank quickly issued warnings to all transit drivers, urging them to watch for road debris. These stories show us that school buses, because they carry many passengers, can sometimes become attractive targets for dangerous criminals. In these terrifying moments, the courage of people like Ed Ray and the quick thinking of everyday people are often the only things standing between survival and tragedy. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.